I came home early to find my wife in tears alone, but my son-in-law's parents were sitting in my living room with papers for my house. I smiled because they were about to regret ever stepping foot in my home. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with entitled in-laws. My name is Edgar Calloway. I am 70 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought I had built a peaceful life for my family. For decades, I had worked construction, saved every penny, and quietly built a real estate portfolio that afforded us more than just a comfortable living. But I always preferred a simple life. Faded jeans, a sturdy Ford truck, and weekends spent fishing on the lake. My wife Cynthia and I raised our daughter Camille to value hard work and respect. But love makes you blind, and Camille had fallen hard for Logan Gallagher. Logan played the part of a successful startup founder, but I always saw right through his tailored suits and empty promises. That afternoon, the air on the lake was unusually still. The fish weren't biting, so I packed up my gear early. The drive back to our quiet suburban neighborhood was uneventful. I parked my truck in the driveway, expecting the familiar smell of Cynthia's cooking or the sound of the television from the living room. Instead, an eerie silence hung over the house. I walked through the front door, and the first thing I noticed was the unnatural quiet. I set my tackle box down in the hallway and moved toward the kitchen. There, sitting at our small oak table, was my Cynthia. Her face was buried in her hands, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. She looked up when she heard my boots on the floor. Her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a desperation I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage, when we struggled to make ends meet. "What is it?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, steady hum. Before she could answer, a loud laugh echoed from the living room. It wasn't Camille's laugh, and it certainly wasn't Logan's. It was the distinct, arrogant braying of Howard Gallagher, Logan's father. I left Cynthia in the kitchen and walked into the living room. There, sitting on my leather sofa as if they owned the place, were Howard and Diane Gallagher. Logan sat in an armchair directly across from them. They were sipping the herbal tea Cynthia usually saved for special occasions. The atmosphere in the room felt dense, heavy, with a smug sense of entitlement that immediately put me on edge. Edgar, Howard boomed, setting his teacup down with a clatter. "We didn't expect you back so soon. Did the fish finally get tired of your stories?" I ignored the jab and kept my eyes fixed on the coffee table. Lying there right next to a plate of untouched biscuits was a stack of legal documents. At the very top, the words "Deed of Trust" glared back at me in bold black ink. "What is going on here?" I asked, my voice remaining level, a practiced calm hiding the sudden spike in my heart rate. Logan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Diane leaned forward, her smile sickly sweet. "We were just having a lovely chat with Cynthia, Edgar. We were discussing Logan's little tech venture." "It is not a little venture, Mom," Logan snapped defensively. "It is a scaling phase. I just need a bridge loan to cover the next quarter until the venture capital comes through." "And how does a bridge loan for your startup involve a deed transfer for my house?" I asked. Howard steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on his knees. "It is simple, really. Logan needs collateral for the loan. The bank requires a tangible asset. Since you and Cynthia have this beautiful debt-free home, we thought it would be a perfect fit. Cynthia being the supportive mother-in-law, she has completely understood the situation." "Understood," I repeated, looking back toward the kitchen where my wife was still crying silently. "She voluntarily agreed to sign the house over to you. She sees the big picture," Edgar, Diane added, her tone laced with that familiar condescension. "She knows that family helps family, and besides, it is only temporary. Once Logan's company takes off, he will transfer it right back." I looked at the documents again. I could see Cynthia's signature at the bottom of the first page. It was shaky, uneven, completely unlike her usual graceful script. She hadn't signed this voluntarily. She had been cornered, ambushed in her own home by people who thought they could bully their way into our lives. The audacity was staggering. These were people who lived in a massive gated community, drove European luxury cars, and constantly reminded us of our working-class background. They had always treated Camille as if she were a charity case they had graciously accepted into their pristine bloodline. And now they were sitting in my living room demanding the house I had bought with decades of sweat and sacrifice. I looked at Logan. He was avoiding my gaze, studying a speck of dust on his expensive Italian leather shoes. "Why didn't you ask your own parents for collateral?" "Logan?" I asked. Logan cleared his throat. "My parents' assets are tied up in complex trusts and international investments. It would take too long to liquidate anything. The bank needs a clean local asset." "It is a simple transaction," Edgar, Howard insisted, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't complicate things. We are offering you a chance to be part of Logan's success." I remained silent, letting the weight of their demands hang in the air. I knew my wife. Cynthia was strong, but she hated conflict. She would endure almost anything to keep the peace, especially when it came to Camille's happiness. They had weaponized her love for her daughter against her. Diane, noticing my hesitation, let her mask slip just a fraction. Her voice dropped, losing its fake sweetness and adopting a sharp, calculating edge. Look, Edgar, we all know how much Camille relies on our financial guidance. Logan has a fantastic career trajectory. It would be a shame if this little hiccup forced them to relocate. Logan has a very lucrative offer in Seattle. I am sure Camille would hate to take the grandchildren so far away from you and Cynthia, but if his company fails here, they will have to go where the money is. It was a blatant threat. Sign over your home or lose your daughter and grandchildren permanently. They were holding my family hostage, using their geographical location as leverage. The sheer cruelty of the tactic was breathtaking, but I didn't let my anger show. In business and in life, showing your hand too early is a fatal mistake. I looked from Diane to Howard, then to Logan. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw them out. I gave them exactly what they wanted, to see an old blue-collar man intimidated by their wealth and legal jargon. I see, I said softly, walking over to the coffee table. I picked up the stack of papers. The weight of the deception felt heavy in my hands. If it is to keep Camille and the kids close, then I suppose we have to do what is necessary. Logan let out a breath he had clearly been holding. Howard smiled, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. See? I told you he would be reasonable, Diane. I appreciate your understanding. Edgar. Diane purred, reaching for her teacup again. We all want what is best for the children. I held the papers tightly, my thumb pressing against Cynthia's trembling signature. However, I added, my tone shifting just slightly. I never sign anything without reading the fine print. It is a habit from my construction days. You understand, right, Logan? The devil is in the details. Logan nodded quickly, eager to please now that he thought he had won. Of course, Edgar. Take your time. We need it finalized by tomorrow afternoon, though. The bank is waiting. I will review it tonight, and we can finalize it tomorrow, I promised, offering a tight, forced smile. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to check on my wife. I turned my back on them and walked out of the living room, the papers clutched in my hand. I could hear their muted, self-congratulatory whispers as I walked down the hall to my study. I locked the door behind me and sat at my heavy mahogany desk, the only luxury item I allowed myself in the house. I spread the documents out under the desk lamp. The first page was the deed transfer, standard boilerplate language assigning the property to a holding company controlled by Logan. Cynthia's signature sat there, a testament to their emotional extortion. I flipped to the second page and then the third. As I dug deeper into the stack, my blood ran cold. The deed transfer was just the cover sheet. Beneath it lay a high-interest loan agreement from a private equity firm, a firm I recognized from my own real estate dealings as a notorious predatory lender. Logan wasn't getting a bridge loan from a reputable bank. He was borrowing money from sharks. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. At the bottom of the loan agreement, bold and clear, was my signature. It was a flawless forgery. Every curve, every loop perfectly mimicking the signature I used on official documents. Logan hadn't just ambushed my wife, he had committed a felony. He was planning to use my forged signature to secure a massive loan, and when he inevitably defaulted, the loan sharks would come for my house. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the study pressing in on me. They thought they were dealing with an ignorant old man. They thought they could bully my wife, steal my home, and use my name to cover their debts. They had vastly underestimated the man they were trying to ruin. The silent adjustment had begun, and they were going to pay for every single lie. I stared at the forged signature under the harsh glow of my desk lamp. The ink was dry, but the betrayal felt entirely fresh. The private equity firm listed at the top of the page was notorious in my industry. They were not a standard banking institution. They were ruthless financial predators dressed in tailored suits, operating aggressively on the fringes of the law. They preyed on desperate startups and vulnerable homeowners, extending massive lines of credit with extortionate interest rates. When a borrower defaulted, they did not send polite collection letters. They sent enforcers to seize assets with brutal efficiency. Logan had essentially placed a ticking time bomb inside my home. My initial instinct was to pick up my phone and call the authorities immediately. A forgery of this magnitude was a clear felony. I could have Logan arrested before dinner was served, but my eyes drifted back to the first page of the document. Right beneath the primary borrower line, I saw Cynthia's shaky signature. My blood turned to absolute ice. Logan had not just asked her to sign over the deed. He had tricked her into signing a comprehensive guarantor clause. The fine print explicitly stated that if the primary borrower defaulted or faced criminal charges, the guarantor assumed full and immediate liability for the entire debt, including all penalty fees. If I called the police and had Logan arrested for fraud, the loan would instantly default. The firm would legally pivot their aggressive collection tactics directly onto Cynthia. She would be dragged through civil court, her reputation ruined, and her stress levels pushed beyond a breaking point she could not handle. Logan had engineered a perfect legal hostage situation. He had used my wife as a human shield against his own criminal actions. I carefully folded the documents and placed them in my secure wall safe. Panic is a luxury afforded only to the unprepared. I needed a surgical strike. I required a method to dismantle Logan completely without catching Cynthia in the crossfire. I picked up my secure mobile line and dialed a number I reserved strictly for emergencies. Jonathan Reyes answered on the second ring. Jonathan was not a traditional family lawyer. He was a corporate shark who specialized in aggressive asset protection and hostile takeovers. I outlined the situation with clinical precision, detailing the forged signature, the predatory loan, and the legal trap set for Cynthia. Jonathan listened in complete silence. When I finished, he delivered his assessment with cold and calculating clarity. "We cannot involve law enforcement yet, Edgar. We need to starve him out first. We must cut the oxygen line to his finances. Once he is suffocating, he will make a mistake. We choose financial warfare over police intervention." I agreed immediately. It was time to sever the invisible lifeline I had provided for my daughter's family. For 3 years, I had maintained a covert trust fund managed through a shell corporation. Every month, that trust deposited a substantial sum into a holding account that Logan believed was venture capital dividend revenue. That money paid for their luxury vehicles, their mortgage in the upscale district, and the designer clothes they wore while looking down on me. I had subsidized their arrogance simply to ensure Camille never experienced financial hardship. I grabbed my keys and walked briskly past the living room. Howard and Diane were still laughing, sipping tea, and celebrating their perceived victory. I did not look at them. I exited through the garage and started the engine of my heavy-duty Ford truck. The drive to my primary financial institution took exactly 12 minutes. I navigated the afternoon traffic with a singular, relentless focus. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The time for silent subsidies was officially over. I was going to drain the holding account, freeze the proxy corporation, and let Logan face the brutal reality of his own failures. I parked in the VIP client section and bypassed the main teller lines, heading straight for the executive offices. I needed to execute the emergency freeze protocol immediately. I pushed open the heavy glass door to the branch manager's office. Marcus recognized me instantly. He stood up from his desk, his face completely pale, his expression a mixture of confusion and deep professional concern. "Edgar," he stammered, stepping quickly around his desk. "I am so glad you are here. I was just trying to reach your emergency contact." I held up a hand to stop him. "Marcus, I need you to initiate a total lockdown on the Proxy Trust account immediately. Freeze all outgoing transfers and revoke all secondary authorizations." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to his computer monitor. "Edgar, you are 5 minutes late." I stepped forward, the air leaving my lungs. "Explain it to me now." Marcus turned the monitor toward me. "Logan Gallagher is currently sitting in the office of our downtown branch manager. He initiated a full liquidation of the trust fund 10 minutes ago." I felt a surge of pure adrenaline. "How is that possible?" I demanded, my voice sharp and commanding. "The security protocols on that account require my direct biometric approval or a certified legal mandate." Marcus pulled a scanned document onto the screen. His hands shook slightly. He presented a certified medical power of attorney, Edgar. It bears a judge's stamp and a signature from a private psychiatric board. The document declares you legally incapacitated due to severe and rapid onset dementia. Logan has been granted emergency conservatorship over all your known assets. The transfer of your entire trust balance is pending final clearance right now. I stared at the pending wire transfer flashing aggressively on Marcus's computer screen. The green progress bar was moving with agonizing slowness, but it was steadily creeping forward. Logan was in the process of transferring $8.5 million out of my proxy trust and directly into an untraceable offshore holding account located in the Cayman Islands. Marcus frantically hit a series of keys on his keyboard, his forehead glistening with a thick layer of cold sweat. "I am entirely locked out, Edgar," he stated, his voice tight with panic. The downtown branch manager has already authenticated the court order in person. The central banking system now officially recognizes Logan as your absolute legal conservator. I cannot manually override a verified medical power of attorney without a direct court injunction. We have to call the corporate legal department in New York. I slammed my heavy hand onto his mahogany desk, rattling his ceramic coffee mug and silencing his excuses. We do not have time for corporate lawyers to debate institutional liability. That international wire transfer will clear the final clearinghouse in less than 3 minutes. You need to cancel it right now. Marcus shrank back into his leather chair. The banking software explicitly requires a dual verification protocol to halt a conservator-mandated wire transfer. I am entering my branch denial code, but the downtown mainframe is continuously overriding my commands. They are pushing the transaction through from the executive terminal. The bank's bureaucratic firewall was doing exactly what it was programmed to do. It was protecting the asset holder from unauthorized interference. The bitter irony was that the digital system currently viewed Logan as my authorized protector and me as a rogue threat attempting to steal my own wealth. Marcus grabbed his desk phone to call the downtown branch directly, but I knew his efforts were completely useless. The teller working the downtown window was strictly following institutional protocol. A junior manager looking at a flawless forged document signed by a fake judge would never stop a multi-million-dollar transfer just because a colleague across town called and told them to. The digital progress bar crept past 70%. Every single second that ticked by brought Logan closer to stealing my family's financial security and handing it over to a predatory loan syndicate. If that money successfully crossed international lines, it would be gone forever, vanishing into a labyrinth of anonymous shell companies. I needed a completely different level of authority. I needed the master key. I turned away from Marcus and looked at the ceiling. The regional director of this financial institution occupied the penthouse suite of this very building. I was completely done asking for permission from middle management. I walked out of Marcus's office, entirely ignoring his panicked protests trailing behind me. I headed straight across the lobby for the private elevator reserved exclusively for senior executives. The armed security guard stationed at the executive elevator stepped forward, immediately raising a gloved hand to block my path. "Sir, this area is strictly restricted to board members and regional directors." I did not break my stride for a fraction of a second. I reached inside my jacket pocket, pulled out my black titanium founder's card, and pressed it directly against the biometric scanner panel mounted on the marble wall. It is a heavy slice of anodized metal issued only to individuals holding more than $50 million in liquid assets within the institution. The machine beeped sharply, flashing a solid green light, and the heavy steel doors slid open instantly. The guard stepped backward, his eyes wide with profound shock. He had likely never seen a founder's card in person. I stepped into the elevator and slammed my fist against the button for the top floor. The doors opened to a sprawling glass-walled office offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Richard Sterling, the regional director, was sitting at his massive desk reviewing a portfolio. Richard and I had done business together for 20 years. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew that my covert holding company essentially underwrote a quarter of his branch's commercial real estate portfolio. He looked up, deeply startled by my sudden physical intrusion. "Edgar, what is the exact meaning of this? You cannot just barge in here past security." I crossed the expansive room in 3 long strides, grabbed the edge of his computer monitor, and violently turned it to face me. "Logan Gallagher is currently standing at your downtown branch executing a massive wire transfer using a forged medical power of attorney. If that money leaves my account, I will pull every single commercial investment I have with this bank before the global market opens tomorrow morning. I will personally trigger a localized liquidity crisis that will cost you your career by Friday afternoon." Richard blanched, all color draining from his face. He looked at the screen, his hands flying across his keyboard with practiced speed. He pulled up the master transaction ledger. The wire transfer was hovering at exactly 95%. It was mere seconds away from clearing the final international protocol. "Richard Verge," said my voice, carrying the lethal calm of a man holding a loaded weapon. "Initiate a code. Black total asset freeze. Do it right now." Richard did not hesitate to question me. He bypassed the standard employee override protocols, directly accessing the bank's master control mainframe. He typed in his supreme authorization credentials and hit a large red command key on his interface. The computer screen flashed a bright crimson warning. "Global account freeze initiated." I watched the progress bar on Logan's wire transfer halt violently at 99%. The word pending vanished from the screen, instantly replaced by a bold red declined notification. A wave of ice-cold satisfaction washed over my entire body. Richard looked up at me, breathing heavily. "The accounts are completely locked, Edgar. No money can move in or out of any associated portfolio." I placed both of my hands flat on his desk, leaning in close. "Permanently revoke all secondary authorizations. Delete every single power of attorney currently on file. From this exact second forward, absolutely no transaction occurs on any of my accounts without my physical presence and a retinal scan. Implement the highest biometric security tier you possess." Richard nodded quickly, typing furiously to authorize the new absolute security parameters. The invisible financial lifeline I had provided for my ungrateful son-in-law was officially severed. Logan was currently standing at a teller window across town, staring at a declined receipt, completely exposed and entirely vulnerable to the violent financial predators he owed. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the cool afternoon air. The chaotic energy of the financial district buzzed loudly around me, but my mind was perfectly still. I had successfully neutralized the immediate threat to my assets, but the war was far from over. I unlocked my heavy Ford truck and climbed into the driver's seat. Before I could even put the metal key in the ignition, my secure phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I checked the caller ID display. It was Logan. He had never dialed this specific secure number before. He must have demanded it from the terrified bank teller during his frantic attempt to understand why his multi-million-dollar theft had been brutally rejected. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. The heavy toxic silence stretched across the line for 2 full seconds before Logan spoke. The polished, highly respectful tone he always used in front of my daughter was completely eradicated. His voice was a guttural, venomous hiss, stripped of all polite pretense. "You just made a huge mistake, old man. You think you are incredibly smart. You think you can easily lock me out of what I am owed. You have no idea what is coming for you." I kept my breathing perfectly steady, completely refusing to give him the satisfaction of a verbal reaction. I simply listened coldly, analyzing the profound desperation driving his threats. He was cornered, and cornered rats bite blindly at anything near them. "Listen to me very carefully," Logan snarled, his voice vibrating with rage. "A private, court-appointed psychiatrist is arriving at your house this afternoon to evaluate Cynthia. She already signed the deed transfer under extreme duress. Once my doctor declares her mentally unstable and entirely dependent on my care, I will petition a judge for full legal guardianship over her person. I will control where she lives, what medications she takes, and who is allowed to visit her. Turn the money back on right now, or your wife goes to a locked psychiatric facility by nightfall. I will take everything from you, Edgar. You will die with nothing." The line went dead. He had hung up the phone. Logan genuinely thought he had played his ultimate trump card. He arrogantly believed that threatening my wife would break my resolve and force me into immediate submission. He was fundamentally wrong. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. I started the engine of my truck. I had an appointment to keep at my house. I pulled my heavy truck into my driveway to find Howard and Diane standing on my front porch. They had intercepted Cynthia before she could even process the morning trauma. Diane stepped forward. Her voice dripped with artificial warmth. She insisted we attend a late lunch at their exclusive country club immediately. It was a blatant stall tactic. They needed to keep me occupied. They needed me away from my secure phone and my home office until Logan and his hired psychiatrist arrived to corner Cynthia. I agreed instantly. I needed them talking. I needed them comfortable. I needed them to hang themselves with their own unparalleled arrogance. We arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club 30 minutes later. The valet visibly scoffed at my truck. Howard waved the young man off with a patronizing chuckle. He tossed his luxury car keys to the attendant with practiced dismissal. The dining room was a sprawling sea of crystal chandeliers, polished oak, and whispered elitism. It was a sanctuary for old money and closed doors. They guided us to a secluded corner table overlooking the manicured golf course. Howard ordered a bottle of vintage Bordeaux without glancing at the price. Diane immediately launched her verbal assault. She complimented Cynthia on her dress. She added a sharp caveat stating it was surprisingly elegant for someone who shopped at discount racks. She turned her attention to me. Her eyes gleamed with malice. She asked if I felt out of place, surrounded by people who inherited wealth rather than sweating for it. She wondered aloud how difficult it must have been growing up in the marginalized neighborhoods I came from. She framed her insults as polite curiosity. Howard chimed in. He made a pointed joke about how my calloused hands might scratch the fine sterling silverware. He suggested that my financial success was likely a stroke of blind luck rather than calculated business acumen. They wielded their casual racism and classist disdain like surgical scalpels. They spoke of generational wealth and neighborhood demographics. They heavily implied that my presence in their pristine world was a fortunate accident they were generously tolerating. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lash out in anger and validate their prejudiced assumptions about angry black men. I did not react. I sat perfectly still. I absorbed every insult. My silence fueled their audacity. They completely mistook my iron discipline for submission. Inside the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, a digital recorder captured every single syllable. I maintained absolute composure. I ate my meal methodically. I nodded at their insults as if they were discussing the weather. I poured Diane another generous glass of the Bordeaux. The alcohol quickly dissolved her remaining filters. Her cheeks flushed a deep red. Her voice grew louder, cutting through the refined quiet of the dining room. She leaned across the pristine white tablecloth. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She began boasting about their extravagant lifestyle. She bragged about winter vacations in the Alps and summer cruises in the Mediterranean, but the arrogance rapidly morphed into a sloppy, unforced confession. She complained bitterly about the club's exorbitant membership dues. She whined about the suffocating pressure of maintaining their social standing among their peers. Then she made a fatal error. She laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound. She told Howard that my little house would finally plug the leak in their sinking ship. She explicitly stated that Logan utilizing my property as collateral was the only thing preventing their primary estate from going into immediate foreclosure. Howard tried to hush her. The color drained completely from his face. He grabbed her wrist under the table. But the damage was entirely irreversible. Diane pulled her arm away and slurred her words. She declared that my assets were merely a temporary cash flow solution for a family of their caliber. She admitted they were drowning in debt. She confessed that my lifetime of hard work was destined to bail out their financial incompetence. She called me a stepping stone for Logan's inevitable success. I committed her confession to memory. I ensured the recording device captured the exact magnitude of their parasitic scheme. They had just handed me a legally binding admission of premeditated financial exploitation. I took a slow sip of my water. I possessed the exact leverage required to annihilate their entire existence. I just needed the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The heavy mahogany doors of the dining room swung open. Camille walked toward our table. My heart leaped for a fraction of a second. I hoped my daughter had come to pull us away from this toxic ambush. I hoped she had seen through Logan's lies and rushed to stand by her parents. She pulled out a chair and sat down next to Diane. She did not look at me. She did not ask how her mother was doing. Camille folded her hands on the table and looked at me with cold, unfamiliar eyes. She repeated Logan's script with chilling accuracy. She spoke with a rehearsed clinical detachment. She told me I looked exhausted. She claimed my recent behavior was becoming a massive burden on the entire family. She urged me to surrender all my financial responsibilities to Logan immediately. She stated I was getting too old and forgetful to handle complex decisions. She claimed Logan told her I was hiding money because my mind was failing. She suggested that signing the conservatorship papers was the only way to prevent me from ruining my own legacy. She warned me that my stubbornness was tearing her marriage apart. My own daughter, the child I had protected from every hardship, was weaponizing my age against me. She had completely swallowed the poison Logan fed her. She believed his lies about my mental decline. She viewed me as a liability that needed managing. She stated she was doing this out of love, but her words were laced with Logan's manipulation. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult Howard or Diane had thrown at me. I looked at Cynthia. She was silently weeping into her napkin, her heart breaking right in front of me. I looked at Camille. She was unrecognizable in her blind devotion to a predator. She had chosen her abusers over her protectors. I stood up from the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my napkin. I buttoned my jacket, feeling the cold, hard weight of the recorder against my chest. The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for silent adjustments was ending. I had a fake doctor to meet, and I was going to tear their entire world to the ground. I drove Cynthia away from the country club in absolute silence. The heavy doors of my Ford truck shut out the toxic elitism of the Gallaghers, but the damage inflicted on my wife lingered in the passenger seat. She stared blankly out the window, her hands trembling in her lap, utterly broken by our daughter's blind betrayal. I kept both hands gripped firmly on the steering wheel. I did not offer empty words of comfort. Comfort was a luxury for peacetime. We were officially at war. I needed a clear operational battlefield for the next phase of my strategy. We pulled into our driveway precisely at 3 o'clock. A sleek black sedan was already parked near the curb. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stood on my front porch holding a leather medical bag. This was Dr. Eris Thorne. He possessed the polished, overly groomed appearance of a physician who spent more time attending high society galas than treating actual patients. He turned and offered a sympathetic, deeply artificial smile as we walked up the pathway. He introduced himself with a practiced, soothing tone. He claimed Logan had sent him out of profound familial concern for Cynthia's cognitive well-being. He spoke of age-related memory degradation and the heavy stress of financial mismanagement. He insisted on conducting a preliminary evaluation immediately inside the living room. I did not block his entry. I unlocked the front door and ushered him inside with a gesture of cold compliance. I instructed Cynthia to sit on the sofa. I took a seat in the corner armchair, crossing my arms over my chest. I allowed the charade to commence, fully aware that my lawyer, Jonathan Reyes, had entered through the back door 10 minutes earlier and was currently waiting silently inside my study. Dr. Thorne sat across from my wife and opened a pristine notepad. He did not pull out a stethoscope. He did not check her vital signs. He immediately launched into a psychological ambush. His evaluation was not a standard medical exam. It was a rapid-fire interrogation heavily loaded with manipulative leading questions designed exclusively to disorient and confuse her. He leaned forward, adjusting his expensive glasses. "Cynthia, do you often feel overwhelmed and confused when your husband attempts to manage the household finances? Are you aware that you completely forgot to authorize the mortgage payment last month? When Logan bravely stepped in to save your home from foreclosure, did that sudden trauma cause you significant memory gaps?" Cynthia's eyes darted frantically around the room. She was terrified. She tried to answer honestly, stating we did not have a mortgage, but Thorne expertly twisted her words. He talked over her, intentionally elevating her stress levels. He took aggressive notes, nodding with solemn, manufactured pity. He was actively building a fabricated narrative of severe cognitive decline and total financial incompetence on a legal notepad. He intended to rubber stamp the exact preliminary diagnosis Logan needed to secure an emergency medical conservatorship. He clicked his pen, preparing to sign the fraudulent document that would strip my wife of her basic human rights. I stood up from the armchair. My sudden movement halted the scratching of his pen. I told Dr. Thorne the medical examination was permanently concluded. He scoffed, an arrogant smirk crossing his features. He attempted to pull rank, citing his professional medical authority and Logan's legal mandate as the concerned family representative. He warned me that interfering with a medical evaluation would reflect poorly on my own psychiatric assessment. I did not argue with him. I simply looked toward the hallway and gave a brief, sharp nod. Jonathan Reyes stepped out of the shadows of my study and strode into the living room. He carried a thick, unmarked manila folder. He did not wear a suit. He wore dark slacks and a crisp button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, projecting the aura of a man arriving to do dirty work. Jonathan introduced himself plainly as my executive legal counsel. Thorne's arrogant smirk faltered instantly. The sudden appearance of a hostile attorney in a supposedly vulnerable senior citizen's home disrupted his entire script. Jonathan dropped the heavy folder directly onto the glass coffee table right on top of Thorne's medical notepad. We did not ask Thorne any questions. We dictated his reality. Jonathan opened the folder and spread a series of financial documents across the table. "We know exactly who you are." Eris, Jonathan stated, his voice a low, lethal hum. "We know about the underground gambling debts. You currently owe $185,000 to an offshore sportsbook syndicate operating out of Macau. You are 3 months behind on payments. They have already frozen your primary credit lines." Thorne turned the color of ash. He tried to stand up, stammering a threat to call the police, but I placed a heavy hand firmly on his shoulder, forcing him back down into the sofa cushions. Jonathan slid a final highlighted document across the glass. It was a digital wire transfer receipt. "This is a deposit of $25,000 from a shell corporation directly linked to Logan Gallagher. The funds were routed into your personal offshore account at exactly 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. This is a down payment for the fraudulent dementia diagnosis you are currently attempting to write." I stepped directly into Thorne's line of sight, blocking his view of the exit. I laid out his situation with absolute terrifying clarity. You are sitting in my home committing medical fraud, elder abuse, and federal extortion. You are an active participant in a criminal conspiracy to strip an innocent woman of her legal autonomy for financial gain." Jonathan pulled a small digital camera from his pocket. He pressed a button and a solid red recording light blinked to life. He set the camera on the edge of the coffee table, pointing the lens directly at Thorne's sweating face. I gave the doctor two distinct options. Option 1 involved Jonathan delivering this entire folder to the state medical board and the regional FBI field office in exactly 1 hour. Thorne would be stripped of his medical license, lose his lucrative practice, and spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. Option 2 required him to look directly into the camera lens and detail the exact parameters of Logan's scheme. He needed to provide a full, unedited confession outlining the bribery, the forged diagnosis, and his active participation in the conspiracy. Thorne broke entirely. He was not a hardened criminal. He was a cowardly opportunist wearing a stethoscope. His breathing turned ragged. He stared into the blinking red light of the camera and spilled every single detail. He admitted that Logan approached him a week ago. Logan paid him the $25,000 retainer to fabricate a severe dementia diagnosis for both Cynthia and me. The ultimate goal was to establish Logan as our sole medical proxy, granting him unquestioned legal authority to liquidate all our physical assets and isolate us in a heavily medicated state at a substandard care facility. But as Thorne's panicked confession continued, his voice trembled violently. He revealed a much darker, far more immediate truth. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "Logan is not just stealing your house to fund a failing tech startup," Thorne stammered, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. "That entire business is a front. Logan owes money to a highly organized, extremely violent loan shark syndicate operating out of the industrial district. He leveraged the forged deed to your house as collateral for a massive underworld loan to cover his own gambling and lifestyle debts." Thorne swallowed hard, delivering the final catastrophic piece of intelligence. Logan completely defaulted on that loan 2 days ago. He missed the final extension deadline. The syndicate does not use corporate lawyers or civil courts to collect their debts. They use physical enforcers. Thorne warned me that the syndicate had given Logan one final bloody ultimatum. Logan promised them the physical property to wipe his slate clean. "Tomorrow morning their collectors are arriving at your front door," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "They are coming to physically seize the property and forcibly evict everyone inside. They do not care about your legal rights or your age. They are coming to clear the house by any means necessary." The threat was no longer confined to courtrooms and bank accounts. It was physical, immediate, and extremely violent. The silent adjustment had just escalated into a literal war for our survival. I looked at Jonathan. He shut off the camera. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, familiar adrenaline of a man preparing to defend his territory. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when the heavy thud of knuckles hammered against my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was a demand. I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of black coffee, fully dressed and entirely prepared. I glanced at the security feed on my tablet. 2 men stood on my porch. They were built like freight trains, wearing ill-fitting leather jackets that did little to hide the bulk of concealed firearms. These were not repo men sent by a bank. These were the enforcers Dr. Thorne had warned me about, the blunt instruments of an underground syndicate arriving to collect their pound of flesh. I placed my coffee mug on the counter and walked to the foyer. I unlocked the deadbolt and swung the door wide open. The men loomed over the threshold, expecting me to shrink back in terror. The lead enforcer, a man with a thick scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stepped forward. He did not bother with a greeting. He held up a thick manila folder and slammed a hand against the doorframe. "You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises, old man," he growled, his voice scraping like sandpaper against concrete. "Your son-in-law defaulted on a major financial obligation. This property was listed as collateral. It belongs to us now." He shoved a heavily stamped document toward my chest. It was a copy of the deed transfer bearing my flawlessly forged signature. They genuinely believed they were executing a routine eviction of a helpless senior citizen. They anticipated tears, panic, and a frantic scramble to pack suitcases. I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward. I looked the scarred man dead in the eye, holding his gaze with a cold, unyielding intensity that forced him to pause. I took the document from his hand and glanced at it with utter disdain. Then I stepped aside and gestured toward the hallway. "If you want to seize a multi-million-dollar asset, you better come inside and sit down," I said, my voice a low, commanding baritone. "Because right now, you are holding a piece of trash and your boss is going to be very unhappy when he finds out you got played by a desperate kid." The two enforcers exchanged a wary glance. They were accustomed to intimidation and violence, not an invitation into a quiet suburban study. The sheer confidence of my demeanor threw them off balance. They stepped inside, scanning the perimeter for threats. I led them down the hall and into my office, taking my seat behind the heavy mahogany desk. I did not offer them chairs. I forced them to stand like insubordinate employees called in for a reprimand. The scarred man tossed the forged deed onto my desk. "That paper is legally binding," he sneered, trying to regain his aggressive footing. Logan Gallagher signed the property over. The grace period expired at midnight. We are not leaving without the keys. I picked up the forged document and tossed it directly into the wastebasket. I unlocked my bottom drawer and pulled out a certified leather-bound portfolio. I dropped it onto the desk with a heavy thud. "You men break legs for a living," I stated plainly. "I build empires from the pavement up. You are currently standing in a house paid for with construction money and protected by a masterclass in corporate structuring. Let me give you a brief lesson in high-level real estate law." I opened the portfolio and turned the thick parchment pages toward them. "Look at the primary ownership registry. You will not find my name. You will not find Cynthia's name. You certainly will not find Logan Gallagher's name. This property is entirely owned by a blind corporate shell based in Delaware, which is wholly subsidized by an anonymous holding trust. I designed the legal architecture myself 20 years ago, specifically to render this asset completely untouchable by civil courts, creditors, or predatory syndicates." The second enforcer leaned forward, squinting at the complex corporate structuring documents. "What are you saying?" he demanded, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. "I am saying Logan gave you the deed to a house he does not own and could never legally touch." I explained, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "He forged my signature on a document that holds absolutely zero legal weight in any jurisdiction. Your syndicate loaned millions of dollars against literal air. Logan scammed you. He used my property as a fake shield to buy himself time, and you fell for it hook, line, and sinker." I watched the harsh realization hit them. The intricate legal paperwork was undeniable. The embossed seals of the Delaware State Registry proved my claims beyond a shadow of a doubt. The house was a fortress wrapped in miles of impenetrable red tape. They could not seize it. They could not sell it. If they tried to occupy the premises, my corporate lawyers would have them tied up in federal litigation before noon, resulting in massive exposure for their underground operations. Logan had handed them a worthless piece of paper and walked away with their money. The air in the study shifted from aggressive to dangerously volatile. The anger radiating from the two men was no longer directed at me. It was entirely redirected toward the man who had stolen from their bosses and made them look like absolute fools. The scarred enforcer slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, rattling the glass lamp. "That little punk is a dead man," he snarled, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "We will tear his life apart. He thinks he can hide behind his fancy suits and his rich family. We will burn their entire estate to the ground until we get every single penny of our money back." I remained perfectly still, letting their rage reach a boiling point. Logan had dragged these violent men to my doorstep, attempting to sacrifice my wife and me to save his own skin. He had invited the wolves to my door. It was time to return the favor. I opened my top desk drawer and pulled out a heavy piece of cardstock. I uncapped my fountain pen and wrote down a highly specific set of instructions. I slid the card across the polished wood toward the scarred man. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the wet ink. "Logan does not live here," I said, my voice a sharp whisper cutting through their fury. "He lives off the generosity of his parents, Howard and Diane Gallagher. They project an image of extreme wealth, but they are secretly facing total financial ruin. The address on that card is their primary estate in the Gated Heights district. The 6-digit sequence below it is the override code for their private security gate. It bypasses the guard station completely. You can drive right up to their front door." The enforcer looked at the card and then looked back at me, a dark mutual understanding passing between us. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk. "Logan brought your problem to my front door," I stated coldly. "I am giving you the exact key to deliver it directly to his. I suggest you pay the Gallaghers a visit before they figure out his scheme and skip town with your money." The two men did not say another word. They pocketed the card, turned on their heels, and marched out of my house. I remained at my desk, listening to the heavy front door slam shut. A moment later, the roar of their engine echoed through the neighborhood as they sped out of my driveway. The hounds had been officially released, and they were heading straight for the Gallagher estate. I sat in my quiet study and watched the antique grandfather clock tick away the minutes. The silence in my house was absolute. It was the calm before a very specific storm. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and waited for the inevitable explosion. It took exactly 47 minutes for the illusion of the Gallagher empire to shatter into a million jagged pieces. My secure mobile line rang. The caller ID flashed Logan's name. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I did not say a word. I simply pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the absolute chaos unfolding on the other end. The background noise was a symphony of destruction. I heard the sharp, sickening crash of expensive porcelain shattering against hardwood floors. I heard the heavy thud of furniture being overturned. Above the violence, I heard Diane Gallagher screaming. Her voice was completely stripped of its refined country club arrogance. It was a raw, guttural shriek of genuine terror. Howard was shouting in the distance, begging someone to put a weapon down. Then Logan spoke. His voice was a high-pitched, frantic whisper. He was hiding somewhere breathless and terrified. "Edgar, you have to help us. They are tearing the house apart. They have guns. They are going to kill my parents. Please, Edgar, you have to wire the money. I know I messed up. I know I lied, but you cannot let them die." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The rich, dark roast tasted exceptionally good. I listened to Logan sob. The man who had sat in my living room mere hours ago plotting to steal my home and lock my wife in a psychiatric ward was now begging for his life. The pristine, wealthy facade of the Gallagher family was being dismantled by the very thugs Logan had hired to intimidate me. "They want $2.5 million. Logan stammered, his voice breaking as another loud crash echoed in the background. "They said they will burn the estate down with us inside if the funds do not hit their account in the next 20 minutes. You froze my trust fund, Edgar. I know you have the liquidity. Please, I will do whatever you want. I will sign anything. Just save us." "You will sign exactly what I tell you to sign," I stated, my voice radiating absolute unyielding authority. "I will wire the exact amount needed to clear your debt with the syndicate. I will do it to spare my daughter the trauma of explaining your violent death to my grandchildren. But you are going to pay a heavy price for my capital." I tapped the keyboard on my desk, bringing up a secure encrypted file Jonathan Reyes had prepared earlier that afternoon. I forwarded the document directly to Logan's email. "Open it," I commanded. I heard Logan frantically tapping his phone screen. "What is this?" he asked, his breathing ragged. "It is a 24-hour promissory note," I explained coldly. "It legally binds you, Howard and Diane, to repay the $2.5 million by this time tomorrow. But the financial repayment is completely secondary. Read the stipulations attached to the collateral clause." Silence hung on the line for a few seconds, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Edgar, you cannot be serious," Logan gasped. "This document is a literal confession." It was indeed a masterpiece of legal entrapment. Jonathan had drafted the stipulations with surgical precision. To accept the funds, Logan, Howard, and Diane had to digitally sign a binding addendum admitting to the systemic financial exploitation of a senior citizen. The document explicitly stated that Logan forged my signature on the fraudulent deed transfer. It included a sworn admission that they bribed a medical professional to manufacture a fake dementia diagnosis for my wife. By applying their digital signatures, they were formally waiving their right to a trial and confessing to multiple federal felonies. It was an ironclad, guaranteed prison sentence wrapped in a bailout. "You are asking us to sign our own arrest warrants," Logan panicked. "We will go to jail. You can go to a federal penitentiary, or you can go to the county morgue." I replied, devoid of any empathy. "The choice is entirely yours. I am holding the wire transfer authorization. I will hit send the second I receive all 3 verified digital signatures. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide before I hang up this phone and block your number." Another crash shattered the background noise, followed by Diane sobbing uncontrollably. Logan did not have a choice. I heard him running down a hallway yelling for his parents. He shoved the phone at them, screaming at them to sign the digital prompts to save their lives. Howard tried to argue, but the sound of breaking glass silenced him. 3 distinct notification chimes pinged on my computer monitor. Jonathan's secure software verified the biometric and digital signatures. Logan, Howard, and Diane Gallagher had just legally confessed to every single crime they committed against my family. They had signed away their freedom. "I have the signatures," I confirmed. "Wire the money," Logan begged, weeping openly. "Please, Edgar, wire it now before they hurt my mother." I executed the transaction. The banking software authorized the release of $2.5 million from my private reserve, routing it directly to the designated account Logan had provided. The confirmation receipt flashed green on my monitor. I disconnected the call without saying another word. The initial phase of my financial warfare was complete. I had absolute legal leverage over the Gallagher family. I leaned back in my chair, expecting a moment of quiet satisfaction. My secure line rang immediately. It was Jonathan Reyes. His voice lacked its usual smooth, professional cadence. It was urgent and sharp. "Edgar, we have a massive problem," Jonathan stated rapidly. "I have been running a trace on the routing numbers Logan gave you for the syndicate. The money did not go to the debt collectors." I sat forward instantly. "Explain that to me, Jonathan." The account Logan provided was a sophisticated dummy proxy. Jonathan explained, his fingers clacking aggressively over his keyboard in the background. "As soon as your wire cleared, the proxy bounced the entire $2.5 million into a private offshore holding account in Zurich. I just hacked the flight manifest for the international terminal at the airport. Logan is not paying the thugs, Edgar. He used the chaos at the mansion as a distraction to finalize his exit strategy." I stared at the glowing monitor, my jaw clenching tight. Where is he going? "He booked 2 first-class one-way tickets to Switzerland, departing in exactly 3 hours," Jonathan revealed. "Passenger 1 is Logan Gallagher. Passenger 2 is a woman named Sarah Jenkins. He is fleeing the country with his secret mistress. He just used your bailout money to fund a new life overseas. He is abandoning Camille, abandoning his children, and leaving his parents locked inside that mansion to face the deadly wrath of the loan sharks completely alone." Logan had played one final desperate card. He had chosen cowardice and abandoned his entire family to absolute slaughter. I grabbed my keys. The time for digital warfare was over. I drove through the city as the afternoon sky darkened into a bruised purple. The engine of my heavy Ford truck roared against the asphalt. Time was a luxury I no longer possessed. Logan Gallagher was 3 hours away from boarding an international flight with $2.5 million of my money and his secret mistress. He was leaving my daughter Camille to face a syndicate of violent loan sharks and a mountain of federal fraud charges. I had spent 35 years shielding Camille from the brutal realities of the world. I worked grueling construction shifts so she could attend the best schools and live a life of absolute comfort. Now I had to be the one to completely shatter her reality. It was the only way to save her life. I pressed the voice command button on my dashboard and dialed her number. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice sounded exhausted, heavily strained by the tension of living in the Gallagher household. She immediately started reciting the same tired script Logan had drilled into her head. She told me I needed to accept my cognitive decline and sign the conservatorship papers to keep the family together. I cut her off. My tone left absolutely no room for debate. I told her to leave the Gallagher estate immediately. I instructed her to meet me at the Silver Diner on Route 9. I told her I was bringing the documents she wanted me to sign. I knew the mention of the paperwork would guarantee her arrival. She sighed heavily and agreed to meet me in 20 minutes. I disconnected the call. The silence in the truck cab was heavy. I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on my own child's marriage. I had to rip away the fairy tale she desperately clung to. If I failed, Logan would vanish into the Swiss Alps, and the police or the loan sharks would be knocking on her door by sunrise. I pulled into the diner parking lot and secured a booth in the far back corner. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of stale coffee and fried food. It was the perfect isolated environment for a hard dose of reality. Camille walked through the glass doors 10 minutes later. She looked immaculate on the outside, wearing a designer trench coat and holding a luxury handbag. But her eyes betrayed a profound exhaustion. She slid into the booth across from me and immediately reached her hand out, expecting me to hand over my financial autonomy. She asked if I brought the conservatorship forms. She claimed Logan was dealing with an emergency at the house and needed the legal clearance to manage the crisis. I did not give her any forms. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the forged deed transfer. I slid it across the laminated table. I told her to look closely at the signature. Camille frowned. She recognized my handwriting but noticed the mechanical perfection of a traced forgery. I told her Logan used this forged document to secure a massive loan from an underground syndicate. I explained that he had completely defaulted, and the collectors were currently threatening her in-laws at the mansion. Camille shook her head aggressively. She refused to believe it. She accused me of manufacturing a story to ruin her marriage. I anticipated her denial. I pulled out the second document. It was the flight manifest Jonathan Reyes had intercepted. I placed it directly on top of the forged deed. I read the details aloud. I told her Logan was booked on a first-class flight to Zurich, departing in 2 hours. I pointed to the second passenger name, Sarah Jenkins. I watched the color drain completely from Camille's face. She stared at the name. She whispered that Sarah was Logan's executive assistant. I confirmed her suspicion. I told her Logan had just extorted $2.5 million from me under the guise of saving his parents. Instead of paying the syndicate, he routed the money to a Swiss proxy account and was abandoning her to take the fall for his massive financial crimes. Camille was trembling now. She tried to formulate a defense, but the words died in her throat. I delivered the final devastating blow. I placed a small digital audio player on the table and pressed play. It was the unedited recording from my lunch at the country club. Camille sat in horrified silence as she listened to Howard and Diane Gallagher. She heard her sophisticated in-laws mock her African-American heritage. She heard Diane call me a stepping stone and an ignorant laborer. She heard them explicitly state they were only tolerating Camille because my bank accounts could bail out their bankrupt lifestyle. They called her a useful idiot. The audio recording ended. The silence in the diner booth was absolute. I had dismantled her entire life in less than 5 minutes. I reached across the table and covered her trembling hands with mine. I told her the hardest truth a father could ever deliver. The Gallaghers never loved her. They never respected her. They viewed her strictly as an entry point to my wealth. I told her Logan was a coward and a predator who was about to leave her holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Camille broke down. The polished facade she had maintained for years completely shattered. She covered her face with her hands and wept openly in the back booth of the diner. It was a raw, agonizing release of grief and betrayal. I did not interrupt her tears. I let her mourn the death of the life she thought she had. I sat quietly, radiating a protective presence. I waited for the sorrow to run its course. It took several minutes, but then I witnessed a profound transformation. The sobbing stopped. Her breathing steadied. Camille lowered her hands. The tears were still wet on her cheeks, but her eyes were fundamentally different. The naive, devoted wife was gone. In her place was a hardened survivor. She wiped her face with a harsh, aggressive swipe of a napkin. She inherited my resilience. The Calloway blood ran deep in her veins. She sat up straight, squaring her shoulders. Her expression turned entirely to cold, calculated fury. She asked me where Logan kept the definitive proof of his crimes. I told her Jonathan suspected Logan maintained a master ledger of his shell companies and offshore accounts on his personal encrypted laptop. If we acquired that device, we could legally destroy him and completely exonerate her. Camille did not hesitate. She told me Logan kept that laptop secured in a biometric safe inside his study at the Gallagher mansion. She stated that with the current chaos involving the loan sharks, his parents would be highly distracted. She volunteered to infiltrate the mansion tonight. She planned to bypass the security protocols, extract the encrypted laptop, and deliver it directly to me before Logan could board his international flight. I warned her of the extreme danger. If Logan or the syndicate caught her, she would be in mortal peril. Camille looked at me with an icy determination that made me incredibly proud. She stated she was no longer a victim. She was going to tear his empire down from the inside. We had a heist to plan. The digital clock on my truck dashboard read exactly 2 a.m. I was parked 3 blocks away from the Gallagher estate, concealed entirely within the heavy shadows of ancient oak trees. Camille was on her own inside the sprawling mansion, but we maintained an open cellular audio line. I listened to the steady, rhythmic cadence of her breathing as she navigated the silent corridors of her in-laws' home. The house was heavily locked down, exhausted from the violent raid by the syndicate earlier that day. Howard and Diane had medicated themselves generously with premium scotch and sleeping pills to escape the terror of their immediate reality. Logan was completely absent, presumably at an airport finalizing his escape with his mistress. This left the massive estate vulnerable to the one woman they had all severely underestimated. Camille whispered her progress into the microphone hidden beneath the lapel of her heavy wool trench coat. She had successfully bypassed the main security alarm using the family master code. She slipped past the grand marble staircase and approached the heavy oak doors of Logan's private study. The room was a sanctuary of fake prestige filled with unread leather-bound books and expensive liquor. Camille knew Logan kept his most sensitive operational files completely disconnected from cloud servers. He stored his master ledger on a localized physical hard drive. She stepped into the dark room, relying solely on the ambient moonlight filtering through the large bay windows. Her target was the biometric wall safe concealed behind a massive abstract painting. Logan Arrogant believed his security measures were impenetrable. He fundamentally failed to realize that a devoted wife pays attention to every minor detail of her husband's daily life. Camille had spent years quietly observing his exact habits. She knew he meticulously wiped down his mahogany desk every evening, but rarely cleaned the numerical keypad of his hidden safe. Using a small ultraviolet flashlight I had provided, she illuminated the latent fingerprints on the keypad. She quickly deduced the 6-digit override code based on the heavy layered smudges over specific numbers. She punched in the precise sequence. A soft mechanical click echoed in the dark. The heavy steel door popped open. Inside, sitting next to stacks of emergency cash, currency, and forged passports, was the encrypted silver laptop. The master ledger of his entire criminal enterprise was officially in her hands. Camille reached into the cold steel cavity and pulled the laptop out. She slipped it securely against her ribs, hiding its rigid rectangular shape beneath the thick, heavy folds of her oversized trench coat. She turned to leave, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins caused a slight physical miscalculation. The sweeping hem of her coat caught the sharp edge of a heavy crystal bourbon decanter sitting on the corner of Logan's desk. The heavy glass tipped over and crashed directly onto the hardwood floor. The sound of shattering crystal was absolutely deafening in the dead silence of the mansion. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck, my heart slamming aggressively against my ribs. Through the open cellular line, I heard Camille freeze. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching rapidly from the upstairs landing. Someone was awake and moving fast. The study door swung open and the harsh, blinding glare of the hallway light flooded the room. It was Diane. She stood in the doorway, clutching a silk robe tightly around her fragile frame. Her eyes were wide with a volatile mixture of leftover terror from the syndicate raid and fresh, sharp suspicion. "What are you doing in here?" Diane demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. She stepped aggressively into the study, her gaze darting from the shattered glass on the floor to Camille standing rigidly by the desk. I listened intensely through the earpiece, waiting for my daughter to break. If she panicked, the entire operation would instantly collapse. But Camille channeled the absolute coldness I had instilled in her just hours prior. Her voice did not waver for a fraction of a second. It did not tremble. She delivered a masterful performance of exhausted, deep annoyance. "I am looking for painkillers," Camille replied, rubbing her temples with her free hand while keeping the other firmly pressed against her coat to secure the stolen laptop. "The absolute disaster your son brought to our front door gave me a blinding migraine. I know he keeps prescription medication in his bottom desk drawer." Diane narrowed her eyes, trying to detect a lie in the dim lighting. She looked toward the open safe, but the heavy shadows of the room obscured the missing computer. She scoffed, her inherent elitism overriding her initial suspicion. She told Camille that snooping around a man's private study in the middle of the night was highly inappropriate behavior for a respectful wife. She complained bitterly about the broken crystal, stating it was a priceless European antique and demanding Camille clean it up immediately. Camille did not argue. She apologized with a flat, deadpan tone, stating she would send the housekeeper to handle the mess first thing in the morning. She smoothly bypassed Diane in the doorway, keeping her coat wrapped tightly around her body to mask the bulk of the machine. She wished her mother-in-law a pleasant night and walked steadily down the hall, leaving Diane grumbling about the severe lack of respect in the younger generation. Camille had flawlessly executed a high-stakes deception right to the face of her primary abuser. I heard the heavy front door of the mansion click shut. Camille rushed down the circular driveway and climbed into her vehicle. She started the engine and drove rapidly out of the gated community, accelerating toward my secure location. We had done it. We had the definitive digital proof required to send Logan and his parents to a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. But as Camille navigated the dark suburban streets, a silent digital alarm was triggered miles away across the city. Logan was pacing the polished floor of an upscale airport lounge, waiting to board his international flight to Zurich. He was sipping a vodka neat, celebrating his imminent escape, when his phone vibrated violently in his jacket pocket. It was not a standard text message or a work email. It was an automated priority push notification from his highly proprietary home security application. Logan pulled the phone out and stared at the glowing screen. The alert flashed in bold red letters, warning him that the biometric safe in his primary study had been manually bypassed. His blood ran instantly cold. He opened the security log, attempting to rationalize the alert. He assumed his desperate parents were searching for hidden cash to flee the violent loan sharks. But the digital timestamp showed the exact moment the override code was entered, followed by a secondary critical alert indicating the physical removal of the laptop from the interior sensor pad. Logan knew his parents completely lacked the technical competence to crack that specific safe. There was only one person intimately familiar with his passwords and his private office layout. The realization slammed into him with the devastating force of a freight train. Camille knew everything. His quiet, obedient wife had just orchestrated a surgical strike on his financial sanctuary. She had taken the only piece of evidence capable of destroying him on a global scale. Logan crushed the plastic cup in his hand, snapping it in half and spilling liquor across the floor. He abandoned his flight, his mistress, and his escape plan, and bolted toward the terminal exit. He had to hunt his wife down and get that laptop back by any means necessary. I sat in the cab of my Ford truck, the engine idling with a low, reliable rumble. The digital clock on the dashboard clicked forward. Camille was supposed to be completely clear of the neighborhood by now. My secure mobile line rang, shattering the quiet tension inside the cabin. I answered immediately. Camille was breathing heavily, her voice laced with absolute panic. She was driving down Interstate 45, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were likely white. She told me she was being followed. A pair of intensely bright halogen headlights had suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror, closing the distance at an alarming speed. I demanded a vehicle description. Camille confirmed my worst fear. It was a silver European sports car. It was Logan. He had somehow tracked her route from the mansion. The realization was chilling. Logan had abandoned his flight to Zurich. He had sacrificed his escape plan with his mistress because he fully understood the apocalyptic value of the encrypted laptop currently resting on Camille's passenger seat. He knew that without that specific computer, his parents might face financial ruin, but with it in the hands of federal authorities, he would spend the rest of his natural life in a maximum security prison. He was not trying to pull her over to talk. He was accelerating to over 100 miles per hour. Camille screamed as the sports car violently bumped her rear bumper. Logan was actively attempting to execute a pursuit intervention technique. He wanted to spin her vehicle out of control at highway speeds. He intended to run his own wife off the road, frame the catastrophic wreckage as a tragic late-night accident, and casually retrieve his master ledger from her lifeless hands. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of his strategy solidified my resolve. He had crossed the final boundary. He was actively trying to murder my child. I ordered Camille to stay completely focused. I told her not to hit the brakes. I instructed her to maintain her speed and head directly for mile marker 42. I put my phone on speaker, dropped my truck into gear, and slammed my heavy boot down onto the accelerator. My Ford truck surged forward, its massive steel frame tearing out of the concealed suburban side street and merging onto the desolate stretch of the interstate. I had driven heavy construction machinery and industrial transport vehicles for over 40 years. I understood weight distribution, momentum, and vehicular physics better than any arrogant corporate executive in a lightweight luxury car. I watched the horizon intensely. Less than a minute later, I saw the headlights approaching fast. Camille's sedan shot past my position, swerving slightly as Logan relentlessly rode her bumper. I pulled out from the shoulder right behind them, instantly maximizing my speed to intercept the pursuit. Logan did not even notice my massive vehicle closing in on his rear blind spot. He was entirely hyper-focused on destroying Camille. I closed the gap with surgical precision. I did not tap my brakes. I drove the heavy steel grille of my Ford directly into the rear quarter panel of his silver sports car. The impact was an explosive crunch of shattering fiberglass and twisting metal. Logan swerved violently, his tires shrieking against the cold asphalt as he struggled to maintain control. He realized instantly that he was no longer the predator. He was now the prey. I downshifted and pulled up alongside his driver's side door. I looked down into his luxury cabin. I saw his face contorted in sheer panic. He tried to accelerate past me, pushing his high-performance engine to its absolute limit. I simply turned my steering wheel to the right. The reinforced steel plating of my truck slammed heavily into his driver's side door. I used the sheer, overwhelming mass of my vehicle to pin his car against the outer guardrail. Sparks showered into the night air as his expensive paint job was mercilessly ground down to the bare metal frame. I maintained relentless pressure, boxing him into a deadly bottleneck. The contrast was poetic. His flashy, hollow luxury was being crushed by solid, earned strength. I calculated the exact trajectory needed to end the chase without inflicting fatal injuries on him. I wanted him to face a judge, not a coroner. As we approached a designated emergency runoff area, I delivered one final aggressive lateral strike. The forceful impact lifted his lightweight sports car entirely off the tarmac. Logan spun out of control, sliding violently down the steep embankment. His vehicle crashed heavily into a muddy ditch, burying its front bumper deep into the wet soil and coming to an abrupt, violent halt. I hit my brakes, bringing my truck to a controlled stop on the shoulder of the highway. The night air was instantly filled with the sharp, acrid smell of burning rubber and leaking radiator fluid. A thick cloud of white steam hissed aggressively from the crumpled hood of Logan's ruined sports car. I placed my truck in park and left the headlights glaring brightly, illuminating the wreckage in a blinding, unforgiving spotlight. Through my speakerphone, I instructed Camille to keep driving straight to Jonathan Reyes's office and to lock the doors the second she arrived. I told her I would handle the trash left on the side of the road. I stepped out of my truck, my boots hitting the asphalt with heavy, deliberate thuds. I did not rush down the embankment. I stood by the guardrail watching the crippled vehicle. For a moment, there was absolute silence, save for the hissing engine. Then the dented driver's side door was kicked open violently from the inside. Logan crawled out of the wreckage. His tailored suit was torn and a thin line of blood trickled down his forehead, but he was entirely fueled by a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. He looked up the embankment and locked eyes with me. He realized immediately who had run him off the road. The realization that the old blue-collar man he had consistently mocked had just systematically dismantled his physical pursuit pushed him over the edge of sanity. He ignored the extensive damage to his body and his vehicle. He stumbled toward the rear of his car and popped the crumpled trunk open. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, solid steel lug wrench. His eyes were wide, feral, and completely devoid of any rational thought. He gripped the heavy weapon tightly, his knuckles white with homicidal intent. He did not care about the police. He did not care about his wife or his parents. He only cared about the encrypted laptop containing the blueprint of his fraudulent empire. He let out a primal, aggressive scream and began charging up the muddy embankment toward my truck. He was fully prepared to bash my skull in and murder me right there on the side of the highway to retrieve his computer. He expected me to retreat in terror. He expected an old man to cower behind a locked door. I stood perfectly still, my posture radiating absolute lethal calm. I waited for him to cross the boundary. Logan crested the muddy embankment with feral aggression, his expensive tailored suit ruined by the wet soil. He swung the heavy steel lug wrench with a wild, unhinged roar. The solid metal connected directly with the driver's side headlight of my Ford truck. The reinforced glass shattered instantly, sending a loud, violent crack echoing through the desolate highway and scattering a cascade of bright sparks and jagged plastic shards across the cold asphalt. He raised the weapon again, his face twisted into a mask of pure sociopathic fury. He hesitated to strike the driver's window, choosing instead to use his voice as his primary weapon. He attempted to regain control through sheer elitist intimidation. He screamed into the night air, his voice cracking with raw desperation. He told me I was nothing but an ignorant old man who had stumbled blindly into money. He claimed his family possessed untethered generational wealth and deep-rooted political connections across the entire state. He threatened to unleash a vicious team of high-powered corporate litigators who would completely dismantle my life, drain my bank accounts, and ensure I died penniless in a state-run facility. He paced aggressively in front of my heavy steel bumper, wielding the bloody wrench like a crude scepter, desperately trying to project a dominance he had completely lost. He boasted about his country club pedigree, his Ivy League education, and his untouchable social status. He called me a working-class peasant who had severely overstepped his boundaries. He demanded I unlock the doors and hand over the laptop, promising that if I complied, he might show mercy and only ruin me financially, rather than physically. His insults were laced with the same coded passive-aggressive racism his mother used at dinner, but now stripped of all polite country club veneer. He was raw, venomous, and entirely pathetic. I watched his chaotic rant through the windshield. I did not lock my doors. I did not reach for a weapon. I simply observed a broken man frantically clinging to a fabricated reality. I pushed the heavy driver's side door open. It swung outward with a solid metallic thud, forcing Logan to take a sudden, involuntary step backward. I stepped down onto the asphalt. I stood at my full height, squaring my broad shoulders against the chilling wind. I did not raise my hands defensively. I did not shout over his frantic, breathless screaming. I spoke in a low, resonant baritone that cut directly through the cold night air and silenced him instantly. I told him to put the wrench down before he made a physical mistake he would never walk away from. Logan gripped the steel tighter, his chest heaving violently, but he did not swing. He was paralyzed by the sheer unyielding force of my absolute calm. I stepped closer, deliberately invading his personal space, and delivered the verbal killing blow that would dismantle his entire psychological foundation. I looked him dead in the eye and informed him that he was threatening me with a ghost empire. I stated clearly and concisely that his parents did not have elite connections or any generational wealth whatsoever. They had been completely irrevocably bankrupt for exactly 10 years. Logan scoffed, his face twisting in frantic denial, but the arrogant confidence drained rapidly from his eyes. I did not give him a single fraction of a second to interrupt. I recited the brutal financial facts with surgical precision. I provided the exact date, October 14th, a decade ago, when his father's primary holdings were officially liquidated by federal creditors. I told him the exact dollar amount of his parents' secondary mortgage, a predatory mortgage that was purchased and entirely subsidized by a blind trust I personally controlled. I watched his monumental ego shatter into pieces as I recounted the specific quarterly dues I anonymously paid to keep their names on the active roster at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I informed him that the luxury vehicles his parents drove were leased under my corporate umbrella, and the designer clothes his mother wore were bought with credit lines backed entirely by my cash reserves. I told him he was not a titan of industry. He was a welfare case dressed in a tailored suit existing entirely on the undisclosed charity of the black working-class man he just spent the last 20 minutes insulting. I stated that his entire life was a subsidized theatrical performance, and I had officially canceled his funding. The absolute truth hit Logan with the devastating force of a physical blow. The heavy steel wrench slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the unforgiving pavement. His knees buckled slightly under his own weight. His breathing became shallow and highly erratic. The grand illusion of his aristocratic superiority was completely eradicated, leaving nothing but a fraudulent coward staring at the true architect of his reality. He opened his mouth to speak to deny the staggering facts, but no words materialized. He was a hollow shell. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens echoed through the quiet suburban valley. Red and blue emergency lights began to flash in the far distance, reflecting brightly off the damp trees and the mangled wreckage of his sports car trapped in the ditch below. The authorities were responding to the violent highway collision. Panic instantly overwrote Logan's shock. He realized the police would soon find the stolen funds routed through his offshore accounts and the definitive proof of his extreme flight risk. He looked at me one final time, his eyes wide with the raw, unfiltered terror of a cornered animal. He turned his back and sprinted desperately into the dense, dark woods bordering the interstate, abandoning his ruined car, his shattered dignity, and his entire fraudulent life. I did not chase him. I simply watched him vanish into the freezing shadows. Camille pulled her sedan up behind my heavy truck, her bright headlights illuminating the chaotic scene on the asphalt. She stepped out of her vehicle, clutching the encrypted silver laptop tightly against her chest. She surveyed the wrecked sports car and the discarded steel weapon, then looked up at me with unwavering resolve. I placed a steady, reassuring hand on her shoulder, acknowledging her incredible bravery and flawless execution. We secured the computer inside my heavy steel lockbox. We left the crash site to the approaching authorities and drove directly to Jonathan Reyes. We held the absolute key to Logan's total destruction, and the final execution was ready to begin. The drive to Jonathan Reyes's downtown office took 20 minutes. We moved through the deserted city streets in absolute silence. Camille sat in the passenger seat, gripping the silver laptop tightly against her chest. Her breathing was steady and measured. The remnants of her highway panic were entirely gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding focus. I parked the heavy Ford truck in the underground garage of the towering legal firm. Jonathan was waiting for us in the polished marble lobby. He did not ask about the shattered headlight on my vehicle or the mud caked on my heavy work boots. He simply took the encrypted machine from Camille and led us directly into his secure server room. The digital execution was about to commence. Jonathan connected the laptop to a heavy external terminal. He utilized military-grade decryption software to violently bypass Logan's security protocols. It took exactly 14 minutes for the firewall to collapse completely. The screen blinked green, and the master ledger flooded the dual monitors in a sea of undeniable evidence. I stood behind Jonathan reading the meticulously categorized spreadsheets. Logan was not running a failing tech startup. He and Howard Gallagher were the sole architects of a massive, highly predatory Ponzi scheme. The sheer scale of the financial devastation was nauseating. They had not targeted wealthy investors or seasoned venture capitalists. They had deliberately preyed upon the retirement funds of elderly minorities within our own community. The spreadsheets listed hundreds of names: African American and Hispanic seniors who had worked grueling decades in factories teaching positions in civil service jobs. Howard used his polished country club charm to gain their trust, holding fake investment seminars at local community centers and church halls. Logan executed the digital transfers, funneling their life savings into offshore proxy accounts. They promised these hardworking people secure high-yield returns. Instead, they stole their pensions to fund European vacations, luxury car leases, and extravagant country club dues. They stripped dignity from the vulnerable to finance their fraudulent aristocracy. My blood ran ice cold. This was no longer just a defensive maneuver to protect my daughter and my assets. This was a strict moral imperative. Howard and Logan were financial predators feasting on the exact demographic I had spent my entire life trying to uplift and protect. Camille read the names scrolling on the screen. She recognized several of them from our local congregation. Her hands curled into tight, shaking fists. She looked at me, her eyes burning with righteous fury. They were not going to get away with a single cent. Jonathan immediately began compiling the digital evidence into a massive secure dossier. He structured the files chronologically, mapping out every fraudulent wire transfer, fake contract, and offshore routing number. We were preparing to hand the entire criminal enterprise over to the federal authorities on a silver platter. Jonathan contacted a senior agent at the regional FBI field office, a man he trusted implicitly. The federal gears were officially turning and the trap was set. While we finalized the digital death warrant, Howard and Diane Gallagher were aggressively continuing their charade, oblivious to their impending doom. They had no idea Logan had abandoned them to flee the country. They were completely unaware that the violent loan shark syndicate was temporarily stalled by my financial intervention. Most importantly, they did not know the encrypted laptop was missing from the biometric safe in their own home. They operated under the arrogant assumption that their sophisticated illusions were still perfectly intact. Howard was moving forward with his most audacious scam yet. He and Diane were hosting a lavish charity gala at the city's most prestigious botanical garden venue that very evening. The event was publicly advertised as a philanthropic effort to raise capital for underprivileged youth programs. In reality, it was a desperate, high-stakes trap. Howard intended to use the glittering event to lure in a fresh batch of wealthy, unsuspecting investors. He desperately needed a massive influx of untraceable cash to pay off the violent loan sharks currently breathing down his neck. He planned to sip premium champagne and steal millions while projecting the ultimate image of aristocratic generosity. I coordinated the exact timing with Jonathan. We decided not to initiate the FBI raid immediately. A quiet arrest in the middle of the night would allow the Gallaghers to spin a narrative of a tragic misunderstanding. They thrived in the shadows of polite society. I refused to grant them that luxury. I wanted their exposure to be completely absolute and undeniably public. They had built their entire identity on the foundation of public perception. Therefore, their total destruction needed to occur under the brightest possible spotlight. We would let them host their glamorous event. We would let them fill the grand ballroom with the city's elite. Then we would bring their fraudulent empire crashing down right in front of their wealthy peers. I returned to my home just as the morning sun began to rise over the suburban neighborhood. Cynthia was awake, waiting for me in the kitchen with a hot cup of black coffee. I held her close and assured her the immediate threat was neutralized. The loan sharks were redirected and Camille was completely safe. We spent the morning resting and mentally preparing for the final phase of the operation. At exactly noon, a private courier arrived at my front porch. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with heavy gold wax. I opened it at the kitchen table with Cynthia and Camille standing beside me. It was an official invitation to the Gallagher Charity Gala scheduled for that exact evening. But it was not a polite gesture of reconciliation. It was a calculated, venomous insult designed to assert dominance one last time before their assumed victory. Howard had included a handwritten note on expensive custom stationery. He addressed me by my first name, completely omitting any respectful title. The note carried a tone of supreme arrogance. He thanked me for the temporary loan, stating the funds had successfully managed his minor cash flow interruption. He commanded me to attend the gala to witness how real money operates. He explicitly demanded I bring Cynthia so she could observe true high society and learn her proper place. I turned to the seating assignment card included in the heavily perfumed envelope. Howard had not placed us at the main tables with the wealthy donors. He had explicitly assigned Cynthia and me to table 42. He added a small condescending handwritten asterisk next to the number. He noted that table 42 was the designated service staff overflow table located in the back hallway near the swinging kitchen doors. He intended to parade us as lowly peasants. He wanted to physically segregate us from the elite crowd, demonstrating to everyone that the black working-class parents of his daughter-in-law belonged solely with the hired help. He aimed to humiliate my wife and me publicly, forcing us to swallow our pride while he masqueraded as a billionaire philanthropist. He genuinely believed I would sit in the back in absolute silent submission. He believed my money had bought me a ticket to a world I was too ignorant to navigate. He had just sealed his own fate. I looked at Cynthia and Camille. I did not throw the invitation away. I placed it firmly on the counter. I told my family to prepare their best evening wear. We were going to a party, and we were going to end the Gallagher legacy of terror tonight. The tires of our black town car crushed the gravel of the Botanical Gardens' circular driveway. I stepped out into the crisp evening air and adjusted the cuffs of my tailored tuxedo. I extended a hand to Cynthia. She emerged wearing a breathtaking emerald gown that draped perfectly over her shoulders. She held her head high, radiating a quiet, unyielding dignity. Camille stepped out next. She wore a sharp obsidian pantsuit. Her posture was completely rigid, displaying the lethal focus of a soldier entering hostile territory. We did not look like the hired help. We looked like the executioners we had come to be. We approached the grand foyer. The space was a massive cavern of polished marble vaulted ceilings and cascading crystal chandeliers. The city's elite mingled in tight circles, sipping premium champagne and exchanging artificial smiles. Howard and Diane had spared no expense to project an illusion of absolute financial dominance. They used the stolen retirement funds of vulnerable minorities to rent this pristine sanctuary of wealth. Diane was holding court near the entrance to the main ballroom. She wore a garish diamond necklace and a heavily sequined silver dress. She spotted us the exact second we crossed the threshold. Her artificial smile evaporated instantly. A flash of pure visceral disgust twisted her features. She abandoned her wealthy companions and marched directly toward us. She did not lower her voice to preserve the polite country club atmosphere. She intended to make a brutal public spectacle. She wanted an audience for our humiliation. "What are you doing at the front entrance?" Diane demanded. Her voice cut sharply through the sophisticated murmur of the foyer. Several guests turned their heads to watch the confrontation. She pointed a manicured finger aggressively toward a narrow, dimly lit corridor to our left. The invitation explicitly stated your seating arrangement. The service overflow tables are accessed through the catering doors. You are tracking dirt into the main reception area. I stood my ground. I did not look at the catering doors. I kept my gaze locked entirely on her. "We are not using the service entrance, Diane," I stated. My voice was a low, heavy baritone that carried no warmth. "We are walking through the main doors." Diane's face flushed a deep, furious red. Her inherent racism and classist superiority flared violently. She waved her hand wildly in the air, signaling for the venue's private security team. Two heavily built men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the wall and moved rapidly toward our position. "You are absolutely not walking through those doors," Diane spat. Her voice rose to a shrill, desperate pitch. "You do not belong here. You do not fit the aesthetic of our elite donors. You are making my guests incredibly uncomfortable. This is an exclusive high-net-worth gathering, not a charity kitchen. Security, remove these people from the premises immediately. They are trespassing." The two security guards stepped directly in front of me. They squared their shoulders, attempting to form a physical wall of intimidation. "Sir," the lead guard commanded. He placed a heavy hand on his radio earpiece. "You need to vacate the foyer right now, or we will forcefully escort you off the property." The surrounding guests began to whisper. The aristocratic crowd watched with predatory amusement, expecting to see a black family physically thrown out of their pristine event. Diane crossed her arms over her chest, showcasing a smug, victorious smirk. She genuinely believed she possessed the absolute authority to erase our existence from her sight. She believed her fake wealth granted her total command over the building. I did not argue with the guards. I did not raise my voice to protest the blatant discrimination. I looked past the wall of security and locked eyes with a man standing nervously near the coat check. He wore a distinct silver name tag identifying him as Mr. Harrington, the general manager of the entire Botanical Garden estate. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers twice. It was a sharp, commanding sound. "Mr. Harrington," I called out. My voice echoed off the marble walls, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "Step over here immediately." Harrington flinched. He recognized the tone of a man accustomed to giving orders that were never questioned. He rushed over, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He glanced nervously at Diane and then back at me. "Sir," he began, stammering slightly. "Mrs. Gallagher has rented the ballroom for the evening. If she requests your removal, I have to comply with the client's wishes." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tuxedo. I did not pull out a VIP ticket. I did not pull out a fat wallet to bribe him. I pulled out a single thick document printed on heavy premium stock. It was stamped with the raised gold seal of a Delaware holding corporation. I thrust the document directly into Harrington's chest, forcing him to take it. "Read the top paragraph," I commanded. "Read the listed corporate owner, and then read the name of the primary executive director holding unquestioned operational control." Harrington adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the legal document. His eyes scanned the heavy black ink. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. His jaw went completely slack. The paper trembled violently in his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a profound, unadulterated terror. He realized in a fraction of a second that he was not speaking to an unwanted trespasser. He was looking directly at the anonymous billionaire landlord who owned the very ground he was standing on. "My corporate shell company purchased this entire Botanical Garden estate 5 years ago in a private cash transaction." Harrington swallowed hard. He turned his panicked gaze toward the 2 security guards who were still attempting to block my path. "Stand down," Harrington barked, his voice cracked with panic. "Step away from this man immediately. Back away right now." The guards exchanged a highly confused glance, but they instantly recognized the sheer terror in their boss's voice. They took 3 rapid steps backward, creating a wide, unobstructed path for my family. Diane uncrossed her arms. Her smug smirk faltered, replaced by a deep, paralyzing confusion. "Harrington, what are you doing?" she demanded, stepping forward. "I paid for this venue. I demand you throw them out into the street." Harrington did not even look at her. He bowed slightly at the waist, bending his spine in a display of total submission. He handed the document back to me with shaking hands. "Mr. Calloway, I am profoundly sorry for this unacceptable disrespect. I had absolutely no idea you were attending tonight. Please accept my deepest apologies. You have absolute run of the estate." The grand foyer fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The wealthy elite guests stopped sipping their champagne. Their whispered conversations died instantly. The name Calloway meant nothing to them, but the undeniable display of a general manager bowing to a black working-class man shattered their entire understanding of the social hierarchy. Diane Gallagher froze completely. Her brain aggressively rejected the reality unfolding in front of her. She stared at the embossed document in my hand and then looked at my cold, unyielding face. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a wrecking ball. The man she had spent the last 3 years insulting, the man she deemed too ignorant to handle money, the man she tried to banish to the service hallway was the literal owner of the multi-million-dollar property she was currently renting. Her knees buckled slightly. The champagne glass in her hand shook violently, spilling expensive liquor onto her sequined dress. She tried to formulate a sentence, but her throat tightened, closing entirely around her vocal cords. I did not offer her a single word of explanation. I did not gloat. Her humiliation was merely a logistical stepping stone to my ultimate objective. I stepped around her frozen, trembling figure as if she were a meaningless piece of furniture. I looked directly at Mr. Harrington. My expression was carved from solid granite. I pointed toward the massive, heavy oak double doors sealing off the grand ballroom. Inside, Howard was actively charming his wealthy targets, completely oblivious to the massacre occurring in the foyer. "Open those doors," I commanded. "Do not knock. Do not announce our presence. Push them wide open and secure them to the walls." Harrington nodded frantically. He practically ran toward the entrance, gesturing aggressively for the security guards to assist him. They grabbed the heavy brass handles and pulled. The massive oak doors swung outward with a deep, echoing groan, revealing the glittering expanse of the ballroom. Hundreds of guests sat at pristine tables, surrounded by towering floral arrangements. A bright spotlight illuminated the main stage where Howard stood, grinning widely into a microphone. Cynthia stepped forward and firmly linked her arm through my left side. Camille stepped up and took my right arm. We stood together, a unified, impenetrable wall of familial strength. The era of playing the quiet, compliant victim was permanently dead. I had tolerated their racism, their theft, and their psychological warfare for far too long. We stepped over the threshold and walked deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom. The time for silent adjustments was officially over. The public execution of the Gallagher Empire commenced right now. The center aisle of the ballroom felt like a runway leading to the gallows. The aristocratic crowd parted slowly, their whispered conversations dying out as we advanced. They did not know who we were, but they recognized the absolute authority in our stride. My family moved as a single, impenetrable unit. Cynthia held her head high, the emerald gown catching the light from the chandeliers, radiating the quiet strength of a woman who had endured too much. Camille flanked my other side, her sharp suit a testament to her newfound lethal focus. The era of the quiet, compliant in-laws was dead. At the far end of this grand ballroom, the main stage was bathed in brilliant white light. Howard Gallagher stood at the polished acrylic podium. He was completely in his element, holding a microphone and addressing the captive audience of wealthy donors. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that he absolutely could not afford. His voice resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with manufactured charisma and aggressive philanthropy. He was in the middle of his flagship pitch. He spoke passionately about the Gallagher Family Trust, weaving a complex, utterly fictitious narrative about their dedication to community development and high-yield, secure investments. He painted himself and Logan as visionary financial stewards deeply committed to ensuring the prosperity of the less fortunate. He emphasized their pristine generational wealth, claiming it allowed them to take calculated risks for the greater good. It was a masterful, sickening performance designed explicitly to separate these wealthy attendees from their capital to fund the fraudulent empire and pay off the violent syndicate currently hunting his son. Howard was so entirely captivated by his own rhetoric that he did not immediately notice the disturbance rippling through the audience. He raised a glass of champagne, inviting the crowd to invest in their latest, exclusive venture. I did not stop at the edge of the seating area. I did not wait for an invitation. I disengaged from Cynthia and Camille, instructing them to remain near the main aisle. I walked directly up the plushly carpeted steps leading to the main stage. My heavy footfalls echoed dully a steady, deliberate rhythm that finally caught Howard's attention. He turned his head, the charismatic smile freezing instantly on his face. The blood rushed from his cheeks, leaving him a pale, trembling ghost under the harsh stage lights. He recognized me. He recognized the man he had relegated to the service hallway, the man he believed was too ignorant to understand his sophisticated theft. "Edgar," he hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic, panicked whisper as I approached the podium. "What in God's name are you doing up here? Get off this stage immediately. You are ruining the pitch." I did not respond to his frantic whisper. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to step back from the microphone. I reached out and took the heavy microphone from the stand. The sudden shift in power was palpable. The audience fell into a dead, suffocating silence, their eyes fixed entirely on the stage. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors. Then I turned my gaze back to Howard. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the resonant, unwavering clarity of a man holding an executioner's axe. "Good evening," I said, the sound amplifying through the massive speakers. "Howard Gallagher has just presented a fascinating narrative regarding his family's financial stability and philanthropic endeavors. However, I believe in absolute transparency when it comes to investments. Let us review the actual data." I raised my left hand and signaled the audio-visual technician stationed in the elevated booth at the back of the room. Jonathan Reyes had thoroughly briefed him 10 minutes prior, utilizing my absolute authority as the venue owner. The technician hit the master override. The ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed slightly. The 3 massive high-definition projection screens flanking the stage flickered to life. The polished corporate logo of the Gallagher Family Trust vanished instantly. In its place, a massive, high-resolution scan of a federal document filled the screens. The bold red letters at the top read, Chapter 7, Bankruptcy Filing. The date was clearly visible 10 years ago. The primary petitioners were Howard and Diane Gallagher. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy donors leaned forward, squinting at the undeniable legal proof of Howard's financial ruin. Howard lunged toward me, his hands shaking violently, attempting to grab the microphone. "Edgar, stop this right now," he screamed, his aristocratic facade shattering completely. "This is slander. Turn those screens off." I easily sidestepped his frantic lunge, maintaining my grip on the microphone. The screens shifted. The bankruptcy filing was replaced by the forged deed transfer for my property, highlighting the flawless traced forgery of my signature. Next to it, The high-interest loan agreement from the predatory syndicate was displayed, detailing the extortionate interest rates and the imminent threat of violent collection. "Howard claims his family possesses generational wealth," I stated, my voice echoing over the rising murmur of the crowd. "The reality is that he and his son Logan have been operating a massive, highly predatory Ponzi scheme. They have specifically targeted the retirement funds of elderly minorities in our community to finance their bankrupt lifestyle." Howard stumbled backward, his hands covering his face. He realized the absolute finality of the situation. The evidence was irrefutable. But I was not finished. The visual evidence was merely the foundation. I needed the audience to hear the true, unfiltered nature of the Gallagher family. I signaled the technician one final time. The screens went black. The sound system crackled, and then the crystal-clear audio recording from my hidden device filled the expansive ballroom. Diane's voice, slurred with expensive wine, echoed off the high ceilings. She complained bitterly about their suffocating debt. She boasted about using my little house to plug the leak in their sinking ship. She called me a stepping stone and explicitly detailed Logan's plan to steal my assets. The recording transitioned seamlessly to Howard and Logan, discussing the fake investment seminars, mocking the vulnerable seniors they were actively robbing. The raw, venomous racism and classist elitism spewing from the speakers paralyzed the audience. The carefully constructed illusion of the benevolent Gallagher family evaporated into the cold air. They were exposed not just as frauds, but as vicious, calculating predators. The ballroom descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. The wealthy donors, many of whom had just pledged massive sums of capital, erupted in outrage. Shouts of anger and demands for immediate refunds echoed through the cavernous space. Several prominent investors stood up, their faces red with fury, demanding the police be called. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as people rushed toward the stage, demanding answers. Howard backed away from the podium, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route. Diane was frozen near the entrance, surrounded by furious guests demanding explanations. The grand gala had transformed into a hostile mob. Realizing their empire was completely annihilated and a furious crowd was advancing, Howard abandoned the stage. He did not attempt to defend himself. He turned and sprinted toward the rear of the ballroom, aiming for the inconspicuous swinging doors leading to the catering kitchen. He intended to slip out through the service alley and vanish before the authorities arrived. Diane, seeing her husband flee, abandoned her wealthy friends and pushed her way through the angry crowd, desperately trying to follow him. The elite philanthropists were reduced to terrified fugitives crawling toward the service exit they had tried to relegate me to. The grand ballroom was tearing itself apart. The furious shouts of betrayed investors and the frantic scrambling of the disgraced elite created a deafening symphony of absolute destruction. I left Jonathan Reyes to manage the resulting chaos and direct the incoming federal authorities. I scanned the panicking crowd for my daughter, but Camille was no longer standing by my side. She had anticipated Logan's cowardly movements with the razor-sharp precision of a seasoned hunter. She knew the Swiss escape was entirely aborted the moment I crashed his sports car on the interstate. She knew a desperate man required untraceable liquid cash to fund a secondary evasion route. The only immediate source of physical currency in the vicinity was the charity donation lockbox securely fastened near the catering entrance. I moved swiftly through the surging crowd and pushed open the heavy swinging doors leading into the massive industrial kitchen. I bypassed the terrified catering staff and stepped out into the cold, damp air of the back service alley. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, isolating the immediate area from the screaming ballroom. A flickering fluorescent bulb cast harsh, erratic shadows across the wet asphalt and overflowing industrial dumpsters. Logan was entirely focused on his pathetic theft. He stood next to a concrete loading dock, aggressively prying open the heavy steel donation box with a discarded tire iron he must have scavenged from the parking lot. His appearance was a grotesque caricature of his former elite self. His expensive tailored suit was shredded and caked with dried mud from our violent highway collision. The blood from his forehead had dried into a dark crust across his cheek. He managed to crack the lockbox open with a loud metallic snap. He frantically shoved thick stacks of $100 bills into his ruined jacket pockets, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. He was operating on pure animalistic desperation. He did not hear Camille approach. She stepped out from the deep shadows of the loading dock, effectively cutting off his only exit route to the street. She did not yell. She did not threaten him. She simply spoke his name with a chilling, absolute calmness. The sound of her voice froze him completely. Logan spun around, dropping a handful of stolen cash onto the wet pavement. He stared at his wife, his eyes wide with a frantic, calculating panic. He was cornered in a dead-end alley with no car, no flight, and no escape. Logan stared at Camille, searching her face for the compliant, submissive woman he had manipulated for years. He found absolute glacial granite. He instantly realized his usual tactics of arrogant condescension would not work. The predatory businessman vanished entirely. He opted for the final desperate strategy of a collapsing coward. He dropped the tire iron. It clattered loudly against the wet concrete, echoing off the brick walls. Logan collapsed onto his knees right in the middle of the filthy alley. He began to weep. It was a loud, pathetic display of manufactured grief designed specifically to exploit her empathy. He scrambled forward on his knees, attempting to grab the hem of Camille's trench coat. She took a sharp, deliberate step backward, refusing to let his dirty hands touch her clothing. Logan unleashed a torrent of frantic, pathetic excuses. He blamed every single criminal act on Howard and Diane. He claimed his parents had emotionally manipulated him into the Ponzi scheme since he was a young man. He swore they forced him to forge my signature on the loan documents under the threat of disowning him. He painted himself as a tragic victim of their crushing financial expectations and aristocratic demands. He begged Camille to remember their wedding vows and the life they had built. He pleaded for a second chance, claiming they could start over far away from his toxic family. Then he revealed his true underlying motive. He begged her to ask me to unfreeze the bank accounts. He pleaded for access to my wealth, stating it was the absolute only way they could escape the violent loan shark syndicate currently hunting him. He promised he would become the perfect husband if she just convinced me to wire the funds to a secure location. Camille stood perfectly still. She looked down at the man kneeling in the garbage-strewn alley. She did not express anger. She expressed pure, unadulterated disgust. She looked at him as if he were a diseased insect crawling across the pavement. She reached for her left hand. She grasped the heavy diamond wedding ring he had purchased using my stolen money. She pulled the ring off her finger with a single fluid motion. She did not hand it back to him gently. She threw the heavy diamond with immense physical force directly into his chest. The sharp metal struck his collarbone and bounced off, landing in a puddle of stagnant water near the storm drain. She told him he was absolutely nothing. She declared the marriage officially and permanently terminated. She stated he would rot in a federal cell and she would ensure he never saw her or their children ever again. Logan looked down at the discarded diamond resting in the dirty water. He looked back up at Camille's unyielding face. The frantic weeping stopped instantly. The pathetic groveling completely evaporated from his demeanor. He realized with absolute certainty that his primary host had permanently rejected him. The manipulation was entirely ineffective. The mask of the desperate, loving husband melted away, exposing the raw, violent sociopath underneath. The feigned panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dead, hollow darkness devoid of all human empathy. He slowly stood up from the wet asphalt, wiping the grime from his ruined trousers. He did not say another word to defend himself. He reached a steady hand into the inner pocket of his shredded jacket. The sharp metallic click of a spring-loaded switchblade deploying echoed loudly in the narrow alleyway. The polished steel blade glinted dangerously under the flickering fluorescent light. I stepped fully out of the shadows of the kitchen exit, moving rapidly to intercept him, but Logan was fueled by the lethal adrenaline of a trapped predator. He lunged forward with terrifying explosive speed. He bypassed my immediate reach and grabbed Camille violently by her shoulders. He spun her around, locking his left arm aggressively across her chest and pinning her back tightly against his own body. He raised his right hand and pressed the razor-sharp edge of the switchblade directly against her throat. He dragged her backward toward the alley exit, using my own daughter as a human shield to guarantee his survival. The cold, polished steel of the switchblade pressed aggressively against the soft skin of Camille's throat. A single thin drop of dark blood swelled at the edge of the blade, tracing a slow, terrifying line down her neck. I instantly halted my advance. I froze entirely in place, planting my heavy work boots firmly against the wet asphalt. I held my arms slightly away from my sides, demonstrating that I held no physical weapons, but my entire posture radiated absolute lethal violence. Logan dragged my daughter backward toward the brick wall of the alleyway, his breathing shallow and frantic. He used her body as a literal physical shield, attempting to protect his vital organs from my inevitable counterattack. His tailored suit was completely ruined, covered in mud and his own dried blood, but his eyes burned with the manic, unhinged desperation of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He knew his parents were finished. He knew his fraudulent empire was completely annihilated inside that ballroom. He knew his escape flight was boarding without him. He was completely cornered, and cornered predators strike blindly at whatever is closest to them. Logan barked his final desperate demand. His voice cracked with a jagged, manic pitch echoing off the damp brick walls of the industrial alley. He commanded me to take my phone out of my pocket immediately. He demanded an instant wire transfer of $1 million directly into a decentralized offshore cryptocurrency account. He drastically lowered his price from the original $2.5 million, abandoning his parents entirely. He only wanted enough untraceable capital to vanish into the global underground and secure a new identity. He gave me exactly 60 seconds to initiate the transaction. He swore with violent profanity that if the digital confirmation did not appear on his screen in 1 minute, he would sever Camille's carotid artery and leave her bleeding out on the garbage-strewn pavement. He pressed the blade a fraction of an inch deeper to emphasize his deadly resolve. He genuinely thought he had absolute leverage. He arrogantly assumed that a father's unconditional love would instantly override my tactical logic and force me into rapid, terrified compliance. He fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of my protection. I do not negotiate with domestic terrorists. I absolutely do not surrender my resources to cowardly men who hide behind the bodies of women. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I maintained absolute terrifying eye contact with Logan. I stared directly through his frantic, panicked eyes and projected a promise of guaranteed physical destruction. I slowly reached my right hand into the inner breast pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I pulled out my heavily encrypted mobile device. I did not open any banking applications. I did not access any financial portfolios. I unlocked the screen and navigated directly to a specific unlisted contact in my secure ledger. I tapped the call icon and immediately pressed the speakerphone button, amplifying the audio output to maximum volume. The digital dial tone echoed loudly in the tense, suffocating silence of the service alley. The line rang exactly twice. A rough, gravelly voice answered the call instantly. It was the heavily scarred lead enforcer of the Loan Shark Syndicate, the violent debt collector I had redirected to the Gallagher estate earlier that morning. I spoke with a booming, commanding baritone that sliced through the cold night air. I addressed the enforcer directly. I informed him that the man who stole their money and humiliated their operation was currently standing in the rear service alley directly behind the Botanical Garden catering kitchen. I provided the exact street address and the specific geographical coordinates of the loading dock exit. The enforcer let out a low, dark growl of absolute predatory acknowledgement and abruptly disconnected the call. The dial tone hummed loudly from my speaker. I slowly lowered my phone, keeping my lethal gaze locked entirely on Logan. I watched the absolute terror wash over his features, washing away his arrogant demands in a tidal wave of pure primal fear. The horrifying reality of a violent armed syndicate converging on his exact physical location completely shattered his homicidal focus. The loan sharks did not care about hostages. They did not negotiate wire transfers. They executed problems with extreme prejudice. For a singular, critical fraction of a second, Logan's eyes darted frantically toward the dark entrance of the alleyway, expecting heavily armed thugs to pour from the shadows. His physical grip on Camille loosened imperceptibly. He shifted his weight, shifting the razor-sharp edge of the blade a millimeter away from her throat. That microsecond of distraction was the only window I required. I bridged the physical distance between us with explosive, terrifying speed. Decades of heavy construction labor and disciplined military combat training took complete control of my nervous system. I executed a brutal, calculated, disarming strike. I drove the hardened edge of my right palm directly into the exposed radial nerve of his knife-wielding arm with bone-crushing force. Logan screamed in agony as his entire right arm went completely numb, the nerve cluster instantly paralyzed. I simultaneously gripped Camille by the shoulder of her coat and violently yanked her backward, pulling her entirely out of the immediate line of fire. With my left hand, I stepped fully into his physical space and delivered a devastating closed-fist strike directly to his solar plexus. The kinetic energy transferred flawlessly through his ribs. The air violently ejected from his lungs in a wet, ragged gasp. Logan collapsed instantly onto the wet concrete, completely incapacitated, grabbing his chest and gasping desperately for oxygen. The polished steel switchblade clattered loudly across the wet pavement. It skidded across the rough concrete and fell straight through the rusted iron grate of a nearby storm drain, vanishing completely into the dark subterranean runoff below. I stood tall over Logan's crumpled, gasping body. I did not offer him a second glance. I turned my attention entirely to my daughter. Camille stood safely behind my broad shoulders. She rubbed the thin red scratch on her neck where the blade had threatened her life, but she did not tremble. She stood with her spine perfectly straight, looking down at her incapacitated ex-husband with an expression of absolute finality. The threat was entirely neutralized. The silence of the dark service alley was suddenly and aggressively shattered. The heavy, chaotic screech of multiple tires echoed sharply from the main avenue. Flashing red and blue emergency lights violently illuminated the dark brick walls, painting the alleyway in harsh, strobe-like flashes. The federal cavalry had officially arrived. Jonathan Reyes had perfectly timed the ultimate intervention, coordinating directly with his contacts at the regional field office. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents wearing dark tactical gear swarmed the premises with overwhelming localized force. They flooded out of unmarked black SUVs and poured through both ends of the service alley simultaneously. They secured the entire perimeter with aggressive tactical efficiency, pointing high-powered flashlights into the dark corners of the loading dock. Several federal agents rushed past Camille and me, tackling Logan forcefully back down onto the wet concrete. They aggressively pinned his arms behind his back and snapped heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists, reading him his Miranda rights in a loud, commanding tone. He did not struggle. He did not attempt to fight back or formulate an excuse. He laid with his face pressed into the dirty puddle, completely and utterly broken. The grand illusion of his aristocratic superiority was dead, and the federal authorities were here to collect the remains. The cold, wet concrete of the service alleyway gave way to the meticulously manicured pathways of the botanical garden as the federal agents hauled Logan to his feet. He offered absolutely no physical resistance. The violent struggle had been entirely beaten out of him, leaving only a vacant, hollow shell. I kept my right arm firmly wrapped around Camille, guiding her steadily away from the flashing strobe lights of the tactical vehicles securing the rear perimeter. We moved purposefully back through the service corridor, crossing the catering kitchen and emerging into the grand foyer of the main building. The scene unfolding at the main entrance was a masterpiece of absolute systemic dismantling. The massive oak doors were propped wide open, but no one was sipping premium champagne or discussing philanthropic investments. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear had completely locked down the entire property. Through the towering glass walls, I saw the aggressive, flashing red and blue lights of local police cruisers and federal black SUVs barricading the circular driveway. The most devastating element for the Gallagher family was not the heavy handcuffs binding their wrists, but the blinding glare of television camera lights. Local news vans, tipped off by the massive scale of the raid, had already breached the venue gates. Reporters stood on the manicured lawns holding microphones and providing live coverage of the spectacular downfall of the city's fraudulent elite. The authorities marched Howard and Diane Gallagher out of the main ballroom. They were paraded directly through the center of the grand foyer. The silver handcuffs binding their wrists clashed violently against their expensive formal wear. Howard struggled aggressively against the firm grip of two federal agents. His custom-tailored tuxedo was disheveled and stained with sweat. His face was a mask of purple indignation. Diane stumbled clumsily beside him. Her heavy sequined gown dragged across the polished marble floor, and her carefully styled hair was in complete disarray. They were being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the harsh, unforgiving light of public accountability. The news cameras zoomed in, capturing every single agonizing second of their total ruin. The aristocratic illusion was permanently dead, replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of a criminal perp walk broadcast live to thousands of homes across the region. Howard twisted his shoulders violently, attempting to physically shake off the federal agents flanking him. He screamed loud, aggressive profanities that echoed sharply against the marble columns of the foyer. He demanded to speak to the chief of police immediately. He threatened to sue the entire federal government and claimed his elite political connections would have the arresting officers fired and stripped of their pensions by morning. His arrogant bluster was completely ignored. The seasoned agents pushed him forward with clinical mechanical efficiency, treating him exactly like the common violent thief he truly was. Diane presented a vastly different picture of total psychological collapse. Her aggressive superiority and racist entitlement had vanished entirely. She wept uncontrollably, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, jagged streaks. She frantically scanned the crowd of wealthy gala attendees who were currently being corralled and ushered out of the building by law enforcement. These were the people she had hosted, the people she considered her intimate high society peers. Diane reached her handcuffed wrists toward a passing group of elite socialites. She desperately begged them to call her corporate lawyers to advance her bail money and to testify on her behalf. Not a single person stopped to help her. The wealthy donors quickly averted their eyes, accelerating their pace toward the valet stand to escape the media circus. They treated her like a highly contagious disease. They recognized instantly that the Gallagher name was now permanently synonymous with federal indictments, massive financial fraud, and public disgrace. The elite social circle they had sacrificed everything to maintain abandoned them in a fraction of a second. Logan was marched out through the front doors moments later. He looked entirely hollowed out and completely defeated. The deep scratch on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but the psychological wound from his total failure was fatal. He was being led toward a heavy armored federal transport van when his eyes found mine through the crowded foyer. He stopped walking for one brief, agonizing second. I stood near the marble archway anchored firmly in place. I held Cynthia tightly by her hand, pulling her close to my side to comfort her. I positioned myself physically in front of Camille, acting as an impenetrable human shield against the chaos of her former abusers. I did not glare at Logan. I did not offer a victorious smirk. I looked at him with the absolute cold indifference one reserves for a crushed insect on the sidewalk. Logan broke the eye contact first. He lowered his head, staring blankly at the pavement as the agents shoved him forcefully into the back of the transport vehicle. The man who had tried to steal my house and my daughter was reduced to a nameless prisoner sitting in the dark. Diane was being guided toward a separate police cruiser when she suddenly dug her high heels deep into the gravel driveway, refusing to move another inch. The federal agents tried to pull her forward, but she fought them with a burst of frantic, desperate energy. She twisted her body around and locked her tear-streaked eyes directly on me. She stood shivering in the cold night air, entirely stripped of her fake wealth, her stolen properties, and her country club status. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred and profound defeat. She blamed me for the catastrophic wreckage of her life, ignoring her own massive criminal actions. She screamed over the chaotic noise of the wailing sirens and the shouting reporters. She demanded to know if I was finally satisfied with my brutal revenge. She asked if a working-class man like me felt a sick, twisted sense of accomplishment for completely destroying their lives and tearing their prestigious family apart. The federal agents grabbed her arms firmly, preparing to force her into the back seat of the police cruiser. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming, but I spoke with a deep, heavy resonance that carried effortlessly through the damp night air, ensuring she heard every single syllable before the heavy metal door closed on her freedom forever. I looked down at her shivering, pathetic form standing in the gravel, and I delivered the final, absolute verdict. I didn't destroy your lives, Diane. I simply stopped paying for your illusions. The federal agent shoved her inside the vehicle and slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off her frantic sobbing instantly. The police cruisers and the black federal SUVs accelerated rapidly down the long driveway, their sirens wailing loudly into the dark city night. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving the grand botanical estate bathed in quiet ambient lighting. The reporters rushed back to their vans to transmit their explosive footage to the local news stations. I stood on the pristine gravel driveway, holding my wife and my daughter close to me. The suffocating, oppressive weight of the Gallagher family was entirely gone, eradicated by their own greed and my absolute refusal to back down. The air felt incredibly clean. We were finally free to go home. The morning after the Botanical Garden raid brought a profound, unfamiliar stillness to my home. The chaotic storm had finally passed, but the debris remained scattered across our lives. We faced a grueling marathon of federal indictments, civil lawsuits, and relentless court appearances. The emotional toll was heavy, requiring immense fortitude. Cynthia spent the first few weeks processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. She grieved for the illusion of the family we thought we had integrated with. I made sure she attended specialized therapy, shielding her from the aggressive media circus camping outside the federal courthouse. Camille faced a much steeper climb. She had to dismantle her entire adult life brick by brick. She spent long, exhausted nights reviewing legal affidavits and answering invasive questions from federal prosecutors. However, she never once wavered. She channeled her grief into a cold, methodical discipline, refusing to let their manipulation dictate her future. While my family healed, the Gallaghers scrambled desperately to avoid federal prison. Howard and Diane retained a team of notoriously aggressive defense attorneys using the absolute last drops of their hidden liquid cash. They attempted to spin a fabricated narrative portraying themselves as naive victims of Logan's rogue financial ambitions. They begged the federal prosecutor for lenient plea deals, offering to cooperate in exchange for minimal house arrest. Their legal maneuvering failed miserably. Jonathan Reyes had handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation an airtight, completely impenetrable digital vault of evidence. The decrypted laptop provided an exact chronological roadmap of the Ponzi scheme, linking Howard's signature to every fraudulent transfer. The audio recordings I captured at the country club completely decimated any defense of ignorance. The prosecutors laughed at their plea offers. The Gallaghers possessed absolutely no leverage, no hidden assets to trade, and no influential allies left to call. The elite society they worshipped had permanently erased their names from every registry. They were isolated, exposed, and entirely cornered by the undeniable weight of their own criminal actions. The federal judicial system prepared to grind them down with mechanical efficiency. The sentencing hearings were swift and entirely devoid of mercy. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom with Cynthia holding my hand. We watched the final, absolute dismantling of the Gallagher illusion. Logan stood before the federal judge wearing a standard-issued orange jumpsuit. He looked hollowed out, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, stripped of his tailored suits and arrogant smirk. The judge did not mince words. She admonished him for exploiting vulnerable seniors and violently threatening his own wife with a deadly weapon. Logan received a crushing sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He did not look back at us as the heavily armed bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom. Howard and Diane faced the same relentless judicial hammer. The courtroom gallery was packed with the working-class families they had defrauded. The judge highlighted their specific predatory targeting of minority retirement funds, framing their actions as a vile betrayal of public trust. They were both sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The court also authorized a total aggressive liquidation of their remaining estate. Federal marshals seized the sprawling mansion, the leased luxury vehicles, and every single piece of designer jewelry Diane owned. The assets were auctioned off immediately. Every single cent was meticulously routed back into a restitution fund to repay the elderly victims they had scammed. The fake aristocracy was completely liquidated to restore the lives of the people they despised. Camille secured her own absolute victory in family court. The undeniable evidence of Logan's violent assault and massive financial fraud made the divorce proceedings remarkably brief. The judge granted her sole legal and physical custody of my grandchildren. Logan was stripped of all parental rights, permanently barred from contacting them ever again. Camille shed her married name and reclaimed her maiden identity with fierce pride. I refused to let the momentum of our victory simply fade away. I utilized a significant portion of my commercial real estate dividends to establish the Callaway Trust. It was a heavily funded philanthropic foundation designed explicitly to provide free financial literacy programs and aggressive legal protection for vulnerable minority seniors. I did not want to run it myself. I handed the entire operational control over to Camille. She stepped up as the lead executive director with incredible grace. She transformed her profound personal trauma into a powerful protective shield for our community, preventing other families from falling into similar predatory traps. She had finally found her true calling. The dark, suffocating clouds of the past year have completely dissolved, giving way to a bright, clear sky. The narrative of our lives no longer centers on betrayal or defense. It centers entirely on the quiet, earned peace of a warm Sunday afternoon in my backyard. The heavy scent of hickory smoke and slow roasting barbecue ribs drifts lazily over the manicured green lawn. I stand at my custom steel grill, turning the meat with a steady, practiced hand. The heat radiates comfortably against my chest, grounding me in the present moment. I look across the stone patio and watch Cynthia. She is sitting on a woven wicker chair, laughing brightly as our two young grandchildren run through the gentle spray of the lawn sprinklers. The deep lines of stress and worry that once haunted her beautiful face are permanently gone. She is relaxed, completely safe, and entirely cherished. Camille sits at the large wooden picnic table nearby under the shade of an old oak tree. She is reviewing a thick binder of grant proposals for the foundation, sipping a glass of iced tea. She looks up from her paperwork, catches my eye, and offers a warm, genuine smile. She is completely at peace. She is a powerhouse of a woman commanding her own destiny without needing permission from anyone. I close the heavy lid of the grill, and lean against the warm brick patio wall, reflecting on the long, brutal journey that brought us to this exact moment. I am a 70-year-old black man who started his life carrying heavy bricks and pouring wet concrete. I built an empire in total silence, intentionally hiding my strength to live a simple, honest life. The Gallagher family mistook my quiet humility for ignorance. They looked at my calloused hands and my faded jeans and saw an easy target. They believed their fake generational wealth and country club arrogance granted them the absolute right to consume my family and steal my hard-earned legacy. They were fundamentally wrong. They encountered a man who understood that true power never needs to shout. I dismantled their entire fraudulent existence piece by piece without ever raising my voice or compromising my moral center. I protected my wife. I liberated my daughter. I restored stolen wealth to my community. The violent, chaotic storm they brought to my front door was aggressively neutralized by a cold, relentless discipline. The silent adjustment is complete. Dignity is not given, it is enforced. I learned that genuine power never requires an audience or a loud voice. True wealth is not measured by the size of your bank account, the brand of your suit, or the location of your estate. It is measured entirely by the unyielding integrity you maintain when desperate predators attempt to strip away your dignity. Money is simply a tactical tool, but your character remains an impenetrable fortress. When you build your life on a foundation of honest labor and quiet discipline, no amount of fake elitist arrogance can ever tear it down. Always protect your personal peace very fiercely. Did you like my story? Let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.